Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Officer William Rodriguez had been working the graveyard shift in Riverside for 6 years, and he'd learned to trust the feeling in his gut when something wasn't right. The 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift was when the real darkness came out, when people's inhibitions dissolved with alcohol, when domestic arguments turned violent, and when the kinds of things that happened behind closed doors spilled out onto the streets. But as he sat in his patrol car outside the 24-hour laundromat on University Avenue, watching the sparse late-night traffic and writing reports from earlier calls, he had no idea that his next dispatch would take him into a situation that would fundamentally change how he viewed the families in the quiet residential neighborhoods he patrolled. The radio crackled to life at exactly 2:47 a.m., cutting through the steady hum of his patrol car's engine and the distant sound of washing machines spinning in the laundromat behind him. Unit 12, respond to a domestic disturbance at 4521 Maple Street. Caller reports screaming and sounds of a physical altercation. Caller wishes to remain anonymous but states the disturbance has been ongoing for approximately 30 minutes. William keyed his radio and pulled away from his position, feeling the familiar tightness in his stomach that always accompanied domestic calls. Unit 12 responding. ETA 6 minutes. In his experience, domestic disturbances during the graveyard shift were either nothing, couples arguing loudly about money or infidelity, or they were everything, the kind of explosive violence that left someone in the hospital or the morgue. As he drove through the quiet residential streets toward Maple Street, William ran through the mental checklist that had kept him safe during hundreds of similar calls. Domestic violence situations were among the most dangerous encounters a patrol officer could face because emotions ran high, alcohol was often involved, and people were fighting in their own territory, where they had access to weapons and knowledge of escape routes. The key was to arrive prepared for anything, while hoping for the best. Maple Street was in an older part of Riverside where post-war houses sat on large lots surrounded by mature trees that blocked most of the streetlight. As William turned onto the street, he immediately identified 4521, a single-story ranch house with a detached garage, overgrown landscaping, and dim lighting that made it difficult to see activity inside. The house looked quiet from the outside, with no obvious signs of disturbance, but William had learned not to trust appearances when responding to domestic calls. He parked across the street from the house and spent a moment observing before getting out of his patrol car. This was standard procedure. Never rush into a domestic situation without first assessing the scene and identifying potential threats or escape routes. The neighborhood was quiet, with most houses showing no signs of life at nearly 3 a.m. on a Tuesday night. But as William listened carefully, he could hear something that confirmed the anonymous caller's report. Muffled shouting was coming from inside 4521 Maple Street, too indistinct to make out words, but clearly indicating an ongoing argument between multiple people. The voices seemed to be coming from the back of the house, and one of them, a woman's voice, was raised in what sounded like fear or pain rather than simple anger. Between the shouting, William could hear sounds that might have been furniture being overturned or objects being thrown. William keyed his radio to notify dispatch of his arrival. Unit 12 on scene at 4521 Maple Street. Confirming audible disturbance inside the residence, requesting backup to assist with domestic investigation. Copy Unit 12. Unit 8 is available. ETA 8 minutes. 8 minutes was a long time when someone inside a house might be getting seriously hurt, but William knew that charging into a domestic situation alone was a good way to make a bad situation worse. He decided to approach the house and attempt to make contact with the occupants while waiting for backup to arrive. As William walked up the front walkway, the sounds from inside the house became more distinct and more disturbing. The woman's voice was definitely expressing fear, with intermittent screaming that suggested she was in physical distress. The male voice was angry and aggressive, shouting words that William couldn't quite make out but that carried the unmistakable tone of threats and intimidation. The front door was solid wood, painted dark blue, with a small decorative window that was covered by a thin curtain. William could see shadows moving inside the house, indicating at least 2 people in what appeared to be a front living room area. The shadows were moving erratically, consistent with a physical struggle or confrontation. Following standard protocol, William knocked firmly on the door 3 times and announced his presence. "Police department, I need someone to come to the door." His voice carried the authority that came from 6 years of handling domestic calls, loud enough to be heard clearly inside the house but controlled enough not to escalate the situation unnecessarily. The response was immediate and alarming. The woman's screaming intensified, and William could hear what sounded like a physical struggle escalating inside the house. The male voice became louder and more aggressive, and there was a crashing sound that suggested furniture or objects being thrown around the room. "Police department, open the door now," William called out again, his hand moving instinctively toward his service weapon as the sounds of violence from inside the house continued. This time, the screaming stopped abruptly, as if someone had suddenly been silenced. The male voice continued, but it was now directed toward the front door rather than at whoever had been screaming. "Go away! This is private property, and you have no right to be here." William had heard similar responses from dozens of domestic violence suspects over his 6 years on the force. The sudden silencing of the female voice, combined with the aggressive response to police presence, suggested that someone inside the house was in immediate danger, and that the situation was escalating beyond what could be handled through conversation. "Sir, I'm responding to reports of a disturbance, and I need to verify that everyone in the house is safe," William called through the door. "Please open the door so we can discuss this calmly." "There's no disturbance here," the male voice replied. "My wife and I had a disagreement, but everything's fine now. You can leave." The claim that everything was fine was contradicted by sounds William could still hear from inside the house. Muffled crying, furniture being moved, and what sounded like someone trying to clean up evidence of a struggle. More concerning, the woman's voice was no longer audible, which could mean she was unconscious, seriously injured, or being prevented from speaking. William made the decision that officer safety and civilian protection required immediate intervention. "Sir, I'm going to need you to open this door right now, or I'm going to have to enter the house to ensure everyone's safety." The response came in the form of footsteps moving away from the front door toward the back of the house, followed by the sound of a door slamming. William realized that the male occupant was either trying to escape through a back exit or was moving to a part of the house where he could continue whatever he'd been doing to the woman without interference. William tried the front door handle and found it unlocked. Following his training for domestic violence situations where there was reason to believe someone was in immediate danger, he entered the house while calling out his presence and purpose. "Police officer entering the house. I need everyone to remain calm and come to the front room." The interior of the house was dimly lit, with only a few lamps providing illumination in what appeared to be a living room area. The scene immediately confirmed William's suspicions about the nature of the disturbance. Furniture was overturned, including a coffee table and several chairs. Picture frames had been knocked off walls and lay broken on the floor. There were dark stains on the carpet that looked like blood, and the room showed clear signs of a violent struggle. but there was no sign of the woman whose screaming had brought William to the house. "Ma'am, this is the police. Can you hear me? Are you injured?" William called out as he moved carefully through the living room, his weapon drawn but pointed toward the floor. He was trained to clear domestic violence scenes systematically while remaining alert for both injured victims and potentially violent suspects. The house was eerily quiet now, with no response to his calls and no sound of movement from any direction. William could see a hallway leading toward what were probably bedrooms and a bathroom, and an open doorway that led to a kitchen area. Standard procedure required him to clear each area methodically to locate both the victim and the suspect. As William approached the hallway, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were drag marks on the carpet leading from the living room toward the back of the house, as if someone had been pulled or carried while unable to resist. The marks were accompanied by what appeared to be blood drops, suggesting that whoever had been dragged was injured. "Sir, I know you're in the house," William called out. "I need you to come out where I can see you, and I need to know where the woman is. No one is in trouble if we can resolve this peacefully." The response came from what sounded like the kitchen area, a man's voice, but speaking in a tone that was completely different from the aggressive shouting William had heard from outside. Now the voice was calm, almost conversational, which was somehow more disturbing than the previous anger. "Officer, I'm in the kitchen. Everything is under control now. My wife is resting, and we don't need any assistance." The sudden change in the suspect's demeanor set off every alarm bell in William's experience. In domestic violence situations, suspects who went from violent aggression to calm cooperation were often the most dangerous because they'd moved beyond emotional outbursts into calculated behavior. William approached the kitchen doorway carefully, maintaining tactical positioning that would allow him to respond to threats while keeping escape routes available. What he saw when he reached the kitchen would haunt him for the rest of his career in law enforcement. The man was standing calmly beside the kitchen sink, washing blood off his hands with the methodical precision of someone completing a routine task. He was in his 40s, average height and build, wearing jeans and a t-shirt that were splattered with blood. When he saw William, he smiled pleasantly and continued washing his hands as if nothing unusual was happening. "Good evening, officer," the man said in that same conversational tone. "I'm sorry about all the noise. My wife can get quite dramatic when she's been drinking." William kept his weapon ready while scanning the kitchen for signs of the woman. "Sir, I need you to step away from the sink and put your hands where I can see them. Where is your wife?" "She's sleeping now," the man replied, still smiling. "She finally calmed down and decided to take a nap. She'll be much more reasonable when she wakes up." The way he said "sleeping" made William's skin crawl. The calm demeanor, the blood on his clothes, the methodical hand-washing, and the absence of the woman who'd been screaming in terror just minutes earlier all pointed to a situation that had escalated far beyond a typical domestic dispute. "I need to see your wife right now," William said firmly. "Show me where she is." The man's smile never wavered. "I'm afraid she's not available for visitors at the moment, but I can assure you that she's perfectly safe and comfortable." At that moment, William heard the sound of backup arriving, car doors slamming, and footsteps approaching the front door. But he also realized that he was standing in a kitchen with a man who appeared to have just committed a serious, violent crime, and was showing no signs of remorse, fear, or normal human emotion about what had happened. The graveyard shift was supposed to be about routine patrol and minor incidents. Instead, William had walked into a house where something had gone very wrong, and where a man, covered in blood, was calmly washing his hands while talking about his wife as if she was taking a voluntary nap rather than lying somewhere in the house as a victim of whatever violence had occurred in that living room. Officer Jennifer Martinez arrived as backup exactly 8 minutes after William's initial request, but by the time she entered the house on Maple Street, The situation had evolved into something that neither officer had encountered during their combined 12 years of graveyard shift experience. William had managed to handcuff the suspect, who identified himself as Robert Chen, but locating his wife Patricia had proven to be more complicated than a routine domestic violence investigation. "William, what's the status?" Jennifer asked as she entered the kitchen where Robert Chen sat calmly at the kitchen table, his hands secured behind his back, still wearing the blood-splattered clothing he'd been washing at the sink when William found him. "Suspect is secure, but we haven't located the female victim yet," William replied, keeping his voice low enough that Chen couldn't hear the details. "He claims she's sleeping, but there are signs of significant violence in the living room, blood trails leading toward the back of the house, and his behavior suggests this went way beyond a normal domestic dispute." Jennifer observed Robert Chen for a moment, noting the same unsettling calm that had disturbed William. In her experience with domestic violence cases, suspects were usually either belligerent and defensive or remorseful and apologetic. Chen's pleasant, conversational demeanor, while covered in what appeared to be someone else's blood, was unlike anything she'd encountered. "Mr. Chen," Jennifer said, positioning herself where she could observe his reactions, "we need to locate your wife to make sure she's safe. Can you tell us where she is in the house?" Chen looked up at Jennifer with the same pleasant expression he'd maintained throughout his interaction with William. "Officer, I appreciate your concern, but Patricia is fine. She's resting comfortably, and I'd prefer not to disturb her right now. She had a very exhausting evening." The way Chen emphasized exhausting made Jennifer's stomach tighten. She'd worked dozens of domestic violence cases that had escalated to serious injury or death, and Chen's behavior matched the profile of suspects who had moved beyond emotional violence into something much more calculated and dangerous. "Sir, we're going to need to verify her condition ourselves," Jennifer said firmly. "This is not optional. We need to see Patricia right now." Chen's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes that suggested he was calculating his response rather than simply cooperating with a routine police request. "I understand you have procedures to follow, but I'm afraid Patricia is not available for conversation at the moment. Perhaps you could come back tomorrow when she's feeling better." William and Jennifer exchanged glances, both recognizing that Chen's responses were becoming increasingly bizarre. The suggestion that police officers should make an appointment to verify a domestic violence victim's safety was so far outside normal behavior that it confirmed their suspicions about the seriousness of whatever had happened in the house. "Mr. Chen, we're going to search the house now to locate Patricia," William said. "This is happening whether you cooperate or not." Chen nodded pleasantly, as if William had just announced plans to check the weather. "Of course, officer. I understand you have a job to do. Just please be careful not to wake Patricia. She needs her rest." Jennifer began a systematic search of the house, while William maintained custody of Chen, who continued to sit calmly at the kitchen table as if he was waiting for breakfast rather than being detained in connection with a violent crime. The first area Jennifer checked was the hallway that led to the bedrooms, following the blood trail that William had identified earlier. The blood drops led to a closed door at the end of the hallway, but when Jennifer tried the handle, she found it locked. "Mr. Chen, we need the key to this door," she called out to the kitchen. "I'm afraid I don't have the key with me at the moment," Chen replied in that same conversational tone. "Patricia likes her privacy when she's resting." Jennifer had heard enough. She stepped back and kicked the door just below the handle, splintering the wood around the lock mechanism. The door swung open, revealing a scene that would require crime scene investigators, medical examiners, and detectives with experience in homicide cases. The room was a bedroom that had been converted into what could only be described as a makeshift surgical suite. The furniture had been moved against the walls to make space for a large plastic tarp that covered most of the floor. On the tarp was a massage table that had been modified with restraints and equipment that looked more appropriate for a medical facility than a private home. Patricia Chen was on the table, secured with leather straps around her wrists and ankles. She was unconscious but breathing, with what appeared to be surgical wounds on various parts of her body. The wounds were precise and deliberate, not the kind of injuries that resulted from a spontaneous domestic violence incident. Someone had taken considerable time and care to inflict these injuries with surgical instruments. "Jesus Christ," Jennifer muttered as she approached the table to check Patricia's vital signs. "William, call for an ambulance and detective division immediately. We have a victim with serious injuries and what appears to be evidence of torture." Patricia Chen was alive but in critical condition, with precise cuts and surgical procedures that had been performed without proper medical equipment or anesthesia. The room contained medical books, surgical instruments, and documentation that suggested Robert Chen had been conducting experimental surgery on his wife over an extended period of time. Unit 12, requesting immediate medical response and detective division at 4521 Maple Street. William radioed while maintaining visual contact with Robert Chen, who continued to sit calmly in the kitchen as if nothing unusual was happening. "We have a critical injury victim and evidence of aggravated assault with possible torture." The response from dispatch was swift. "Copy Unit 12. Medical and Detective Johnson en route." ETA for medical is 4 minutes. Detective ETA is 12 minutes. As Jennifer worked to stabilize Patricia Chen and document the crime scene, William began a more detailed questioning of Robert Chen, hoping to understand what had motivated the bizarre surgical torture that his wife had endured. "Mr. Chen, can you explain what happened to your wife?" William asked, keeping his tone professional despite his revulsion at what Jennifer had discovered. Chen's response revealed a disturbing psychological profile that went far beyond typical domestic violence. "Officer, Patricia has been suffering from various medical conditions that traditional doctors have been unable to treat effectively. I've been providing alternative medical care that addresses the root causes of her problems." "What kind of medical training do you have?" William pressed, thinking about the surgical precision of the wounds Jennifer had described. "I'm self-taught," Chen replied proudly. "I've been studying medical texts and surgical procedures for several years, and I've developed some innovative techniques for treating conditions that conventional medicine ignores." The implication that Chen had been conducting amateur surgery on his wife over an extended period was horrifying. William realized they were dealing with someone who had convinced himself that torturing his wife was a form of medical treatment, and who had probably been escalating these procedures over months or years. "How long have you been providing this medical care to Patricia?" William asked, dreading the answer. "About 2 years," Chen said matter-of-factly. "She was initially resistant to my treatments, but she's become much more cooperative as she's seen the benefits of my approach." Jennifer emerged from the bedroom with a grim expression and a preliminary assessment that would require extensive medical intervention to save Patricia Chen's life. "William, we need to get her to a trauma center immediately. She's lost significant blood, and some of these wounds suggest internal damage that requires emergency surgery." The paramedics arrived 4 minutes later and immediately took over Patricia Chen's medical care, but their assessment confirmed Jennifer's concerns about the severity of her condition. As they worked to stabilize her for transport, they documented injuries that suggested systematic torture conducted over an extended period of time. "These aren't recent injuries," one of the paramedics reported to William. "Some of these wounds show healing patterns that indicate they were inflicted weeks or months ago. This woman has been subjected to ongoing trauma for a significant period." Detective James Johnson arrived at the scene 12 minutes after William's call and immediately took over the investigation. But the evidence he found in Robert Chen's house would challenge everything he thought he knew about domestic violence and criminal psychology. The bedroom wasn't the only room that Chen had modified for his medical treatments. The basement contained additional equipment, documentation of surgical procedures, and evidence that Patricia Chen had been subjected to increasingly invasive experimental surgery as her husband's confidence in his amateur medical skills had grown. "This goes way beyond domestic violence," Detective Johnson told William as they reviewed the evidence. "This is systematic torture conducted by someone who believes he's providing medical care. The psychological profile suggests we're dealing with someone who's completely disconnected from reality but has been functioning normally in other aspects of his life." Robert Chen's behavior during questioning confirmed Detective Johnson's assessment. Chen continued to maintain that he was a dedicated husband, providing innovative medical care to his wife, and he showed no understanding that his actions constituted torture or criminal behavior. "Detective, I hope you'll consider the medical benefits Patricia has received from my treatments," Chen said during his formal interview. "Traditional doctors would have subjected her to expensive procedures and medications with harmful side effects. My approach is more natural and addresses the underlying causes of her conditions." When Detective Johnson asked Chen to describe these underlying conditions, his responses revealed a delusional belief system that had motivated months of torture. Chen believed that his wife suffered from various imaginary medical conditions that could only be treated through procedures he had designed, based on his interpretation of medical texts and online research. Patricia had toxins in her system that were causing chronic fatigue and depression, Chen explained, with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the evening. "The surgical drainage procedures I developed have been very effective at removing these toxins and improving her overall health." The surgical drainage procedures, Chen described, were actually systematic torture that had left Patricia with permanent physical damage and psychological trauma that would require years of treatment to address. But Chen's complete disconnection from the reality of what he had done to his wife suggested a level of mental illness that went beyond typical criminal behavior. As the sun began to rise over Riverside, William realized that his domestic disturbance call had uncovered a case of systematic torture that had been ongoing for years, conducted by someone who believed he was providing medical care rather than inflicting criminal torture. The graveyard shift was ending, but the investigation into Robert Chen's medical treatments would continue for months as detectives tried to understand how someone could torture their spouse for years while maintaining the delusion that they were providing beneficial health care. Detective James Johnson had been investigating violent crimes for 9 years, but the evidence he found in Robert Chen's house revealed a systematic pattern of torture that exceeded anything in his experience. As Patricia Chen was transported to the trauma center for emergency surgery, Johnson began documenting a crime scene that would require psychological experts and medical professionals to fully understand the scope of what had been occurring at 4521 Maple Street. The basement of the Chen house contained evidence that Robert's medical treatments had been escalating in complexity and invasiveness over the 2-year period he had mentioned to Officer Rodriguez. Johnson found detailed journals documenting procedures that Chen had performed, complete with before and after photographs, surgical notes, and assessments of his wife's progress under his care. "Officer Rodriguez, I need you to understand what we're dealing with here," Detective Johnson said as he reviewed Chen's documentation. "This isn't a domestic violence case that escalated into serious injury. This is evidence of systematic torture conducted by someone who has convinced himself that he's providing medical care. The level of planning and documentation suggests we're looking at someone with a severe psychological disorder who has been operating undetected for years." William studied the journals that Johnson was showing him. feeling sick as he read Chen's detailed descriptions of surgical procedures he had performed on his wife. The entries were written in a clinical style that mimicked legitimate medical documentation, but they described acts of torture that had been inflicted on someone who was restrained and unable to resist. "How is something like this possible?" William asked. "How does someone torture their spouse for 2 years without anyone noticing?" Johnson had been asking himself the same question as he examined the evidence. Patricia Chen was a freelance graphic designer who worked from home. Robert Chen works as a computer programmer for a company that allows remote work. They had minimal social contact with neighbors or co-workers, and Patricia's family lives on the East Coast. If she showed signs of injury or distress, Robert could explain it as medical conditions that she was receiving treatment for. The social isolation that had allowed Robert Chen to torture his wife without detection was a common factor in extreme domestic violence cases. But the medical delusion that had motivated his behavior was unique in Johnson's experience. Chen genuinely believed that he was providing beneficial medical care, and he had convinced Patricia that submitting to his procedures was necessary for her health. "Detective Johnson, we found something else in the basement that you need to see," Officer Martinez called from the bottom of the stairs. "There's a workshop area down here with equipment that suggests Chen has been manufacturing his own surgical instruments." Johnson and William descended to the basement, where Martinez was examining a workbench covered with metal tools, grinding equipment, and what appeared to be partially completed surgical instruments. Chen had apparently been designing and creating specialized tools for procedures that he had invented based on his interpretation of medical texts. This level of preparation suggests that Chen has been planning these procedures for months in advance, Johnson observed. He's not just using existing medical equipment, he's creating custom tools for specific treatments that exist only in his imagination. The basement workshop also contained medical books, printouts from medical websites, and notebooks filled with Chen's theories about various diseases and treatment methods. His research was extensive, but completely disconnected from legitimate medical practice, representing a delusional belief system that had motivated years of systematic torture. Johnson found evidence that Chen had been documenting his wife's treatments, not just for his own reference, but as part of what he believed was groundbreaking medical research that he planned to share with the medical community. He had been preparing detailed case studies and treatment protocols that he intended to submit to medical journals. "He thinks he's going to revolutionize medicine," Johnson told William as they reviewed Chen's research files. "In his mind, he's not a criminal. He's a medical pioneer who's developing innovative treatments that will help thousands of people." The delusion was so complete that Chen had never considered the possibility that his actions constituted torture or criminal behavior. His journals included complaints about Patricia's lack of cooperation with treatments that he believed were obviously beneficial, and frustration that she didn't appreciate the medical care he was providing. As Detective Johnson continued his investigation, Officer Martinez made another disturbing discovery in Chen's computer files. His internet search history revealed that he had been researching more invasive procedures and had been planning to escalate his treatments to include major surgery that would have likely resulted in Patricia's death. "Detective, you need to see this," Martinez said, showing Johnson a folder of bookmarked websites about amputation procedures and organ removal techniques. He's been researching how to perform surgery that would be fatal if attempted by someone without proper medical training. The evidence suggested that Patricia Chen had been saved from murder by the anonymous neighbor who had called police to report the domestic disturbance. If the intervention had been delayed by even a few hours, Chen might have attempted surgical procedures that would have killed his wife, while he maintained his delusion about providing medical care. Johnson's radio crackled with an update from the hospital where Patricia Chen was being treated. "Detective Johnson, this is Doctor." Sarah Williams at Riverside General. The patient is stable but critical. The surgical wounds she sustained are consistent with systematic torture conducted over an extended period. Some of the procedures appear to have been performed with makeshift instruments, and there's evidence of infection and improper healing that suggests ongoing medical trauma. Dr. Williams, what's your assessment of her chances for recovery? Johnson asked. Physical recovery will be possible with extensive surgical intervention and rehabilitation, but the psychological trauma will require specialized treatment. This patient has been subjected to systematic torture while being told it was medical care. The psychological damage from that kind of manipulation will be severe and long-lasting. The medical assessment confirmed Johnson's understanding of the case. Patricia Chen had been the victim of systematic torture that had been disguised as medical care by someone who had completely lost touch with reality. The psychological manipulation involved in convincing someone to submit to torture while believing it was beneficial treatment represented a level of criminal psychology that would require expert analysis to fully understand. As dawn approached, Johnson faced the challenge of interviewing Robert Chen in a way that might provide insight into his psychological state and motivation. Chen continued to maintain his delusion about providing medical care, and he showed no understanding that his actions constituted criminal behavior. Mr. Chen, I need you to help me understand the medical treatments you've been providing to your wife, Johnson said during Chen's formal interview. Can you explain the conditions you were treating and the procedures you used? Chen's response revealed the depth of his delusion and the systematic nature of the torture he had inflicted. Detective, Patricia suffers from a complex array of conditions that conventional medicine doesn't recognize or understand. Through my research, I've identified toxins, parasites, and systemic imbalances that require innovative treatment approaches. What kind of training or education gave you the knowledge to diagnose these conditions? Johnson asked. I'm self-taught through extensive research and practical application, Chen replied proudly. I've studied medical texts, research papers, and online resources to develop a comprehensive understanding of human physiology and disease processes. My approach is more holistic than traditional medicine. Johnson realized that Chen's research had involved misinterpreting legitimate medical information and combining it with pseudoscientific theories he had found online. The result was a delusional belief system that had motivated systematic torture, while Chen maintained complete confidence in his medical expertise. Can you describe some of the specific treatments you've provided? Johnson asked, hoping to understand the progression of Chen's delusions and the escalation of violence they had motivated. Chen began describing procedures he had performed with the same clinical detachment that a legitimate doctor might use to discuss surgical techniques. But his descriptions revealed acts of torture that had been conducted with surgical instruments, restraints, and techniques designed to inflict maximum pain while keeping the victim conscious and aware. The drainage procedures are particularly effective for removing systemic toxins, Chen explained. I developed a technique for accessing lymphatic pathways that allows for direct extraction of accumulated waste products. Patricia's energy levels have improved significantly since we began those treatments. The drainage procedures Chen described were actually systematic torture involving surgical incisions, the insertion of foreign objects, and the deliberate infliction of pain over extended periods. But Chen's description made it clear that he genuinely believed these procedures were beneficial medical treatments. Detective Johnson realized that he was dealing with someone whose psychological disorder was so severe that traditional criminal justice approaches might not be appropriate. Chen's complete disconnection from the reality of his actions suggested a level of mental illness that would require psychiatric evaluation and potentially long-term psychological treatment. But Johnson was also thinking about Patricia Chen, and the long road of physical and psychological recovery she would face after years of systematic torture disguised as medical care. The anonymous neighbor who had called police had saved her life, but the damage that had been inflicted over 2 years would affect her for the rest of her life. As the graveyard shift ended and day shift officers arrived to continue the investigation, Johnson reflected on the case that Officer Rodriguez's domestic disturbance call had uncovered. What had appeared to be a routine domestic violence incident had revealed systematic torture, motivated by delusions that had allowed the perpetrator to maintain his belief that he was providing beneficial medical care. The case would require extensive investigation, psychological evaluation, and medical expert testimony to prosecute effectively. But more importantly, it had revealed how someone with severe psychological disorders could torture another person for years while maintaining complete conviction that their actions were beneficial and necessary. The psychiatric evaluation of Robert Chen, conducted 3 days after his arrest, revealed a psychological profile that challenged everything Detective Johnson thought he understood about criminal motivation and mental illness. Dr. Margaret Foster, a forensic psychiatrist with 20 years of experience evaluating violent criminals, described Chen as one of the most disturbing cases she had encountered in her career. Detective Johnson, Mr. Chen suffers from a complex delusional disorder that has created a completely alternate reality in which he views systematic torture as beneficial medical care, Dr. Foster explained during her briefing to the investigative team. He's not pretending to believe his actions were medical treatments. He genuinely cannot comprehend that what he did to his wife constitutes torture. Johnson had been hoping that the psychiatric evaluation would provide insight into Chen's motivations and potentially reveal whether he understood the criminal nature of his actions. But Dr. Foster's assessment suggested that Chen's psychological disorder was so severe that he might not be competent to stand trial for his crimes. What kind of treatment would be required for someone with this level of delusion? Johnson asked, thinking about the implications for prosecution and sentencing. Years of intensive psychiatric treatment, possibly involving antipsychotic medications and extensive therapy to help him recognize the difference between reality and his delusional beliefs, Dr. Foster replied. But there's no guarantee that treatment would be successful. Some delusional disorders are resistant to intervention, especially when they've been reinforced through years of acting on the delusions. The psychiatric assessment complicated the criminal case because Chen's mental state raised questions about his ability to understand the charges against him and assist in his own defense. California law required that defendants be mentally competent to stand trial, and Chen's complete disconnection from the reality of his actions suggested that he might not meet that standard. Johnson received an update from Riverside General Hospital about Patricia Chen's condition that provided additional insight into the systematic nature of the torture she had endured. Dr. Sarah Williams had completed a comprehensive medical examination that documented injuries spanning the entire 2-year period that Robert had been conducting his medical treatments. Detective, Patricia Chen has sustained injuries that suggest a progressive escalation of violence over approximately 24 months, Dr. Williams reported. The earliest injuries we can identify are relatively minor surgical incisions, but the most recent procedures involved major tissue damage and internal trauma that could have been fatal if not treated immediately. The medical evidence confirmed that Robert Chen's treatments had been escalating in severity and invasiveness, suggesting that his delusions had been growing more dangerous over time. If the police intervention had been delayed, Patricia Chen would likely have died from the surgical procedures her husband was planning to perform. Dr. Williams, what's your assessment of Patricia's psychological state? Johnson asked, thinking about her potential testimony in any criminal proceedings. She's suffering from severe psychological trauma that will require extensive treatment, Dr. Williams replied. But she's also experiencing confusion and guilt because she was convinced by her husband that his procedures were beneficial medical care. She's struggling to understand that she was the victim of systematic torture rather than a patient receiving innovative treatment. The psychological manipulation that Robert Chen had used to convince his wife to submit to torture represented an additional dimension of his criminal behavior. He hadn't just tortured Patricia. He had psychologically manipulated her into believing that the torture was beneficial medical care that she needed for her health. Johnson faced the challenge of building a criminal case against someone whose psychological disorder made it difficult to establish criminal intent, while also preparing to support a victim whose psychological trauma made it difficult for her to understand the nature of the crimes that had been committed against her. 3 weeks after the arrest, Johnson received Patricia Chen's first detailed statement about her experiences during the 2 years of medical treatments. Her account revealed the systematic psychological manipulation that Robert had used to convince her to submit to increasingly invasive and painful procedures. "Detective, at first, Robert told me I was suffering from chronic fatigue and depression that conventional doctors couldn't properly diagnose or treat," Patricia Chen said during her interview at the Victim Advocacy Center. "He showed me medical articles and research papers that seemed to support his theories about toxins and systemic imbalances. When he suggested that he could provide better treatment than traditional doctors, I trusted him because he was my husband, and he seemed so knowledgeable." Johnson listened carefully as Patricia described the gradual escalation that had led from minor procedures to systematic torture. Robert Chen had been methodical in his approach, starting with treatments that seemed reasonable, and progressively introducing more invasive procedures as Patricia became conditioned to accept his medical authority. "The first treatments were actually pleasant," Patricia continued. "Robert would give me massages and vitamin supplements that he said would help detoxify my system. He made me feel like he was taking better care of my health than any doctor ever had. When he suggested more advanced treatments, I trusted his judgment completely." The psychological manipulation Patricia described was sophisticated and deliberate. Robert had established himself as a medical authority figure in his wife's mind, then used that authority to convince her to submit to procedures that became progressively more invasive and painful. By the time the treatments had escalated to obvious torture, Patricia was so psychologically conditioned to trust Robert's medical judgment that she continued to believe the procedures were beneficial, even when they caused severe pain. "When did you start to question whether the treatments were actually helping?" Johnson asked. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, and Johnson could see her struggling with feelings of guilt and confusion that were common among victims of psychological manipulation. "I never really questioned them," she admitted. "Even when the procedures became very painful, Robert explained that the pain meant the treatments were working. He said that removing toxins and parasites from my system would naturally be uncomfortable, but that the long-term benefits would be worth the temporary discomfort." The complete psychological control that Robert Chen had established over his wife was disturbing even by the standards of domestic violence cases that Johnson had investigated. Patricia had been convinced to submit to systematic torture while believing it was beneficial medical care, and she had maintained that belief even when the procedures caused severe injury and obvious physical damage. Johnson showed Patricia photographs of the surgical instruments and equipment that had been found in her house, hoping to help her understand the criminal nature of what had been done to her. But her response revealed the depth of psychological manipulation she had endured. Robert made those instruments himself because he said the tools used by conventional doctors weren't designed for the innovative procedures he was developing, Patricia explained. He was very proud of his craftsmanship and the precision of his techniques. He said that his custom instruments allowed him to provide better care than any hospital could offer. The fact that Patricia could look at torture instruments and described them as evidence of her husband's dedication to providing good medical care, demonstrated the complete psychological control that Robert had established. Johnson realized that Patricia's recovery would require not just medical treatment for her physical injuries, but extensive psychological therapy to help her understand the reality of what had been done to her. "Patricia, I want you to understand that what Robert did to you was not medical care," Johnson said gently. "The procedures he performed were torture, and the instruments he made were designed to inflict pain and injury. You were the victim of serious crimes, not a patient receiving medical treatment." Patricia's response revealed the ongoing impact of the psychological manipulation she had endured. "But Robert spent so much time researching medical treatments and designing procedures specifically for my conditions. Why would he do all that work if he wasn't trying to help me?" Johnson realized that Patricia's psychological recovery would be a long and difficult process that would require her to completely reconstruct her understanding of her marriage and her husband's motivations. The systematic torture she had endured had been accompanied by systematic psychological manipulation that had convinced her to interpret extreme violence as evidence of love and care. 4 weeks after Robert Chen's arrest, Johnson received notification that the district attorney's office was facing significant challenges in prosecuting the case. Chen's psychological evaluation had raised questions about his competency to stand trial, and his complete delusion about the nature of his actions complicated efforts to establish criminal intent. "Detective Johnson, we're dealing with a situation where the defendant genuinely believes that systematic torture was beneficial medical care," District Attorney Maria Rodriguez explained during their case conference. "While that doesn't excuse his actions, it raises complex questions about criminal responsibility and the appropriate legal response to someone with such severe psychological disorders." Johnson understood the legal challenges, but he was also thinking about Patricia Chen and the need for justice in a case involving 2 years of systematic torture. "What are our options for prosecution?" "We can proceed with charges of aggravated assault, torture, and unlawful imprisonment," Rodriguez replied. "But we may need to focus on getting Chen into long-term psychiatric treatment, rather than traditional criminal penalties. The goal should be ensuring that he can never harm Patricia or anyone else again. The legal resolution of the case would require balancing the need for justice with the reality that Robert Chen's psychological disorder made traditional criminal prosecution complicated." But Johnson was also concerned about the precedent that might be set if systematic torture could be excused as the result of mental illness. As the investigation continued, Johnson learned more about the social isolation that had allowed Robert Chen to torture his wife for 2 years without detection. Patricia had been gradually cut off from friends, family, and professional contacts as Robert convinced her that his medical treatments required privacy, and that outside interference could disrupt her recovery. "Robert told me that conventional doctors would try to stop his treatments if they learned about his innovative approaches," Patricia explained. "He said that medical establishments were threatened by independent research and would try to prevent me from receiving the care I needed." The systematic isolation that Robert had imposed was a classic pattern in domestic violence cases, but the medical pretense he had used made it particularly effective. Patricia had been convinced that avoiding traditional medical care and social contact was necessary for her health rather than a form of abuse designed to prevent her from seeking help. Johnson also discovered that Robert Chen had been documenting his medical research, not just for his own reference, but as part of a plan to eventually share his findings with the medical community. He had been preparing detailed case studies and treatment protocols that he intended to submit to medical journals, genuinely believing that his torture techniques represented innovative medical treatments that would revolutionize healthcare. He thought he was going to win a Nobel Prize for his medical His delusions were so complete that he couldn't distinguish between systematic torture and groundbreaking medical research. In his mind, Patricia's suffering was a necessary sacrifice for the advancement of medical science. The depth of Robert Chen's delusions raised disturbing questions about how someone could maintain such a complete disconnection from reality while functioning normally in other aspects of life. He had held a steady job as a computer programmer, maintained his house and financial obligations, and appeared normal to neighbors and co-workers even while conducting systematic torture at home. 6 weeks after the arrest, Johnson received an update that would provide a disturbing conclusion to the case. Robert Chen had been found competent to stand trial after extensive psychiatric evaluation, but his plea negotiations revealed the ongoing impact of his delusional beliefs about his actions. He's willing to plead guilty to assault charges, but he insists on making a statement that his actions were motivated by a desire to provide medical care, District Attorney Rodriguez reported. He still maintains that his procedures were beneficial treatments, and he wants credit for his medical innovations. The persistence of Chen's delusions, even after months of psychiatric evaluation, demonstrated the severity of his psychological disorder and the likelihood that he would continue to view his actions as beneficial medical care regardless of legal consequences or therapeutic intervention. Johnson attended Robert Chen's sentencing hearing, where Chen was given 15 years in prison for aggravated assault and torture charges. But Chen's statement to the court revealed that he continued to maintain his delusions about providing medical care even as he was being sentenced for systematic torture. Your Honor, I hope that someday the medical community will recognize the innovative treatments I developed for my wife's conditions, Chen said during his statement. Patricia's recovery has been remarkable, and I believe my research could help thousands of people who suffer from conditions that conventional medicine cannot treat effectively. The complete disconnect between Chen's perception of his actions and the reality of systematic torture he had inflicted was disturbing even to court personnel who had experience with violent criminals. Judge Patricia Williams noted in her sentencing remarks that Chen's psychological disorder made him a continuing danger to society, regardless of his apparent sincerity about wanting to help people. Patricia Chen's recovery would continue for years as she worked with therapists to overcome both the physical trauma of the procedures she had endured and the psychological manipulation that had convinced her to interpret torture as medical care. Her case became a subject of study for psychologists and social workers who specialized in treating victims of extreme domestic violence and psychological manipulation. 3 months after Robert Chen's sentencing, Detective Johnson discovered that the case at 4521 Maple Street was not an isolated incident. While reviewing cold case files for potentially related crimes, he found evidence suggesting that Chen's medical treatments had been inspired by similar cases in other jurisdictions where people with delusional beliefs about medicine had tortured family members under the pretense of providing health care. Dr. Margaret Foster, the forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Chen, contacted Johnson with disturbing information about a pattern of similar cases that had been reported across California over the past 5 years. Detective, I've been consulting on several cases involving people who torture family members while maintaining delusions about providing medical care. The psychological profile is remarkably consistent, and the escalation pattern is almost identical. Johnson realized that Chen's case might be part of a broader phenomenon involving people with specific types of psychological disorders who developed elaborate delusions about medical treatments that justified systematic torture of family members. The implications were disturbing because these cases were difficult to detect until the violence escalated to the point where victims required emergency medical care. Dr. Foster, how many similar cases have you encountered? Johnson asked. At least 12 cases in California over the past 5 years, and I suspect there are more that haven't been reported or properly identified," Dr. Foster replied. "The pattern involves people with paranoid delusions about conventional medicine who convince themselves that they can provide better treatment through procedures they design themselves." The existence of multiple similar cases suggested that Chen's systematic torture of his wife was part of a pattern of criminal behavior that was being motivated by specific types of psychological disorders. Johnson began coordinating with other law enforcement agencies to identify additional cases and develop strategies for earlier detection and intervention. Johnson's investigation revealed that most of these cases shared common characteristics: social isolation of victims, gradual escalation of violence disguised as medical treatment, and perpetrators who maintained complete conviction about the beneficial nature of their actions. The psychological manipulation involved was so sophisticated that victims often continued to believe they were receiving medical care, even when the procedures caused obvious injury and trauma. The most disturbing aspect is that the perpetrators genuinely believe they're helping their victims, Dr. Foster explained. This isn't sadistic torture motivated by a desire to inflict pain. It's systematic violence motivated by delusional beliefs about providing beneficial medical care. The perpetrators often express genuine concern for their victims' welfare, even while inflicting severe trauma. Johnson received a call from Detective Maria Santos in Sacramento, who had investigated a case involving a man who had performed experimental surgery on his elderly mother while claiming to treat her dementia. The similarities to Chen's case were striking, including the use of homemade surgical instruments, detailed documentation of procedures, and the perpetrator's complete belief in the medical benefits of his treatments. Detective Johnson, our case involved 2 years of systematic torture disguised as medical care, just like yours, Detective Santos reported. The perpetrator had convinced his mother that conventional dementia treatment was harmful and that his procedures could restore her cognitive function. By the time we intervened, she had sustained permanent brain damage from his treatments. The Sacramento case provided additional insight into the psychological profile of people who tortured family members under medical pretenses. Like Chen, the perpetrator had been highly intelligent, socially isolated, and completely convinced of his medical expertise despite having no legitimate training or education in healthcare. Johnson coordinated with the California Department of Justice to develop a database of similar cases and identify patterns that might allow for earlier detection and prevention. The database revealed that these cases were more common than anyone had realized, with at least 23 documented incidents over the past decade involving people who had tortured family members while maintaining delusions about providing medical care. The challenge is that these perpetrators often appear to be devoted caregivers who are providing innovative treatment for family members with medical conditions, explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychologist who specialized in studying delusional disorders. The systematic torture is disguised as medical care, and the victims are often convinced that they're receiving beneficial treatment. The pattern Johnson was uncovering suggested that Chen's case represented a specific type of criminal behavior that was being under-recognized and under-prosecuted because the medical pretense made it difficult to identify systematic torture. Victims were often reluctant to report abuse that they believed was medical care, and law enforcement officers were not trained to recognize the signs of medical torture disguised as health care. Johnson received an update about Patricia Chen's recovery that provided insight into the long-term impact of the systematic torture she had endured. After 6 months of intensive therapy, Patricia was beginning to understand the criminal nature of her husband's actions, but she continued to struggle with feelings of guilt and confusion about her role in submitting to the procedures. Patricia is making progress in recognizing that she was the victim of systematic torture rather than a patient receiving medical care, reported Dr. Susan Martinez, the psychologist treating Patricia. But the psychological manipulation was so complete that she still questions whether some of Robert's treatments might have been beneficial. The ongoing impact of the psychological manipulation Patricia had endured demonstrated the sophisticated nature of the criminal behavior Chen had employed. He hadn't just tortured his wife. He had psychologically conditioned her to interpret torture as evidence of love and medical care, creating trauma that would affect her for years. Johnson's investigation also revealed that Chen had been researching more extreme procedures that would have likely resulted in Patricia's death if the police intervention had been delayed. His computer files contained detailed plans for surgical procedures that involved major organ removal and amputation techniques that no legitimate medical professional would attempt without proper training and equipment. Robert Chen was planning to perform surgery that would have been fatal if attempted by someone without proper medical training, Dr. Foster explained. His delusions had escalated to the point where he was willing to risk his wife's life to conduct what he believed was groundbreaking medical research. The evidence suggested that Patricia Chen had been saved from murder by the anonymous neighbor who had called police to report the domestic disturbance. If the intervention had been delayed by even a few hours, Chen might have attempted surgical procedures that would have killed his wife, while he maintained his delusion about providing innovative medical care. As Johnson compiled his final report on the Chen case, he reflected on the broader implications for law enforcement and public safety. The case had revealed a pattern of criminal behavior that was difficult to detect and prosecute, because it was disguised as medical care and motivated by genuine delusions about helping victims rather than intentional sadism. The graveyard shift domestic disturbance call that Officer Rodriguez had responded to had uncovered not just one case of systematic torture, but evidence of a broader pattern of similar crimes that were occurring throughout California. The challenge for law enforcement was developing strategies to identify these cases earlier and intervene before victims sustained permanent physical and psychological damage. Johnson's investigation had also revealed the importance of community awareness and intervention in detecting cases of systematic domestic violence. The anonymous neighbor who had called police about the disturbance at 4521 Maple Street had saved Patricia Chen's life, demonstrating that community vigilance could be crucial in identifying and stopping systematic abuse that was hidden behind closed doors. But the case had also demonstrated the limitations of the criminal justice system in dealing with perpetrators whose psychological disorders created genuine delusions about the nature of their actions. Robert Chen's complete conviction that he was providing beneficial medical care raised complex questions about criminal responsibility and the appropriate response to crimes motivated by severe mental illness. 18 months after Robert Chen's conviction, Officer William Rodriguez was working another graveyard shift when he received a call that would bring the Maple Street case full circle in ways he never could have anticipated. The radio crackled to life at 10:45 p.m. with a domestic disturbance report that initially seemed routine, but would reveal the lingering psychological damage that systematic torture could inflict on survivors. Unit 12, respond to a domestic disturbance at 847 Pine Street. Caller reports screaming and sounds of someone in distress. Anonymous caller states the disturbance has been ongoing intermittently for several weeks. William felt a familiar tightness in his stomach as he responded to what should have been a routine domestic call. But the address triggered a memory that made him approach the situation with additional caution. Pine Street was less than 2 miles from Maple Street, in the same neighborhood where he had discovered Robert Chen's systematic torture of his wife. The proximity and the similarity of the call description created an unsettling sense of déjà vu. As William drove toward Pine Street, he found himself thinking about Patricia Chen and wondering how her recovery had progressed. The last update he had received indicated that she was living in a supervised residential facility while undergoing intensive therapy to address the psychological trauma from 2 years of systematic torture disguised as medical care. The physical wounds had healed, but the psychological damage from believing that torture was beneficial medical treatment had proven more difficult to address. 847 Pine Street was a small apartment complex with 8 units arranged around a central courtyard. As William parked and prepared to investigate the disturbance, he could hear muffled crying coming from one of the ground-floor apartments. The sound was different from the angry shouting that typically characterized domestic violence calls. This was the sound of someone in emotional distress rather than physical altercation. William approached the apartment where the sounds were originating and knocked on the door, following the same protocol he had used 18 months earlier on Maple Street. Police Department. I'm responding to reports of a disturbance. I need to speak with whoever lives here. The crying stopped immediately, replaced by the sound of movement inside the apartment, and what appeared to be someone trying to compose themselves before answering the door. After several minutes, the door opened to reveal a woman in her 30s with obvious signs of psychological distress. Red eyes from crying, nervous mannerisms, and the kind of hypervigilance that William had learned to recognize in trauma survivors. "Officer, I'm sorry about the noise," the woman said in a voice that William found disturbingly familiar. "I've been having some medical issues that caused me to react strongly to certain treatments. I didn't realize I was being loud enough to disturb the neighbors." William studied the woman's face and realized with shock that he was looking at Patricia Chen. She was thinner than he remembered, with shorter hair and obvious signs of ongoing psychological distress, but there was no doubt about her identity. More disturbing, her explanation for the disturbance involved medical treatments, suggesting that her recovery from Robert Chen's psychological manipulation was far from complete. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Officer Rodriguez. I was one of the officers who responded to your house on Maple Street 18 months ago. Are you receiving medical treatment here in your apartment?" Patricia's reaction to being recognized was immediate and concerning. She became visibly agitated and started explaining that she was participating in a new experimental treatment program that involved procedures similar to those her husband had provided, but under proper medical supervision this time. "Officer Rodriguez, I know what you're thinking, but this is completely different from what Robert did," Patricia said rapidly. "I'm working with a licensed medical professional who understands the innovative treatments that Robert developed. We're refining his procedures to make them safer and more effective." William felt his blood run cold as he realized that Patricia Chen had not recovered from the psychological manipulation she had endured. Instead of recognizing that her husband had tortured her, she had apparently found someone else who was willing to continue similar procedures under the pretense of legitimate medical care. "Mrs. Chen, who is this medical professional you're working with? Are they practicing here in your apartment?" Patricia's explanation revealed that she had been contacted by someone claiming to be a doctor who was interested in continuing the research that Robert Chen had begun. This person had convinced Patricia that her husband's procedures had shown genuine medical promise, but needed refinement and proper documentation to be accepted by the medical community. "Dr. Marcus Smith contacted me 3 months ago after reading about Robert's case in medical journals," Patricia explained. "He said that Robert's research had been groundbreaking but needed to be continued under proper medical supervision. He's been providing treatments that build on Robert's work, but use more advanced techniques." William realized that Patricia Chen was being victimized again by someone who was exploiting her psychological conditioning to submit to systematic torture disguised as medical care. The Dr. Marcus Smith she described was almost certainly another perpetrator with delusions about medical treatment, or worse, someone who was deliberately exploiting Patricia's psychological vulnerability for sadistic purposes. "Mrs. Chen, I need to verify that this Dr. Smith is a legitimate medical professional. Can you show me his medical license and credentials?" Patricia's response revealed that she had not verified the credentials of the person who was performing procedures on her, like her husband, Dr. Smith had established his medical authority through confidence and apparent knowledge rather than legitimate credentials, and Patricia's psychological conditioning from 2 years of systematic torture had made her vulnerable to similar manipulation. Dr. Smith explained that his research is too innovative for conventional medical licensing, Patricia said. He's working outside traditional medical systems because his techniques are so advanced that regulatory agencies don't understand their value yet. The explanation was virtually identical to the justifications that Robert Chen had used to explain why his medical treatments couldn't be provided through legitimate healthcare systems. William realized that Patricia's psychological trauma had made her vulnerable to anyone who could manipulate her conditioned belief that innovative medical treatments required secrecy and isolation from conventional medicine. William asked Patricia to show him where these medical treatments were being conducted, and she led him to a bedroom that had been converted into a treatment room remarkably similar to what Robert Chen had created in their house on Maple Street. The room contained medical equipment, restraints, surgical instruments, and documentation that suggested someone was continuing the systematic torture that Patricia had endured for 2 years in her marriage. "Mrs. Chen, where is Dr. Smith now?" William asked, realizing that he might be dealing with an active crime scene where systematic torture was ongoing. "He's getting supplies for tomorrow's treatment session," Patricia replied. "We are making significant progress in treating the systemic conditions that Robert identified, and Dr. Smith says that a few more procedures should complete my recovery." William immediately called for backup and medical assistance, recognizing that Patricia Chen was in immediate danger from someone who was exploiting her psychological conditioning to continue the systematic torture she had endured from her husband. The medical treatments she was describing were almost certainly torture procedures being conducted by someone who had identified her as a vulnerable victim. Detective Johnson arrived at the scene 20 minutes later and immediately recognized the pattern of systematic torture disguised as medical care that he had encountered in the Chen case. But this time, the perpetrator was someone who had deliberately targeted a survivor of previous torture, exploiting her psychological conditioning to submit to similar abuse. "William, we're dealing with someone who has specifically targeted Patricia Chen because of her previous victimization," Johnson explained, as they documented the evidence in the apartment. "This isn't a delusional belief about providing medical care. This is deliberate exploitation of someone whose psychological trauma makes her vulnerable to manipulation." The investigation revealed that Dr. Marcus Smith was actually Marcus Thompson, a man with a history of fraud and assault charges who'd been following cases of people victimized by medical torture. Thompson had contacted Patricia Chen and other survivors, exploiting their psychological conditioning to submit to procedures they believed were beneficial medical treatments. Patricia Chen had been subjected to systematic torture for an additional 3 months by someone who had deliberately targeted her because of her previous victimization. The psychological manipulation that Robert Chen had used to condition her to accept torture as medical care had made her vulnerable to continued exploitation by predators who understood how to manipulate trauma survivors. When Marcus Thompson returned to Patricia's apartment, he was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including assault, fraud, and exploitation of a vulnerable adult. But the damage to Patricia's psychological recovery was extensive, requiring her to essentially restart the therapeutic process of understanding that she was a victim of systematic torture rather than a patient receiving innovative medical care. Patricia's case demonstrates that survivors of systematic psychological manipulation can remain vulnerable to similar exploitation for years after their initial victimization, explained Dr. Margaret Foster during her evaluation of the situation. The conditioning that convinces someone to interpret torture as medical care can be reactivated by predators who understand how to exploit that psychological vulnerability. The case revealed a disturbing pattern of predators who specifically targeted survivors of medical torture, exploiting their psychological conditioning to continue similar abuse. Patricia Chen's experience demonstrated that recovery from systematic psychological manipulation was a long and vulnerable process that could be disrupted by people who understood how to reactivate the victim's conditioned responses. Officer Rodriguez realized that the domestic disturbance call he had answered on Pine Street was connected to the case on Maple Street in ways that demonstrated the lasting impact of psychological trauma and the vulnerability of survivors to continued exploitation. Patricia Chen had not escaped the systematic torture she had endured in her marriage. She had simply become vulnerable to a different perpetrator who exploited the same psychological conditioning that her husband had created. The graveyard shift was ending as Rodriguez completed his paperwork and reflected on how a routine domestic disturbance call had revealed the ongoing victimization of someone he thought had been rescued 18 months earlier. Patricia Chen's case demonstrated that some forms of psychological damage created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by predators for years after the initial trauma occurred. But the case also demonstrated the importance of community vigilance and law enforcement follow-up in protecting survivors of systematic abuse. The anonymous neighbor who had called about the disturbance on Pine Street had potentially saved Patricia Chen from months of additional torture by someone who had deliberately targeted her because of her previous victimization. As dawn broke over Riverside, Rodriguez realized that the darkness he encountered during graveyard shifts extended beyond individual crimes to include the lasting psychological damage that could make survivors vulnerable to continued exploitation. Some victims never truly escaped their original victimization because the psychological conditioning created vulnerabilities that predators could recognize and exploit indefinitely. The evil that Rodriguez had discovered on Maple Street hadn't ended with Robert Chen's conviction. It had evolved and found new ways to continue through predators who understood that some forms of psychological damage created lifelong vulnerabilities that could be exploited by anyone who understood the victim's conditioned responses to manipulation disguised as care. Patricia Chen would spend years in specialized treatment trying to overcome not just her original systematic torture, but the additional psychological damage from being targeted and exploited because of her previous victimization. The graveyard shift had revealed that some crimes created victims who remained vulnerable to similar exploitation indefinitely, trapped in cycles of abuse that could be reactivated by predators who understood their psychological conditioning. In the quiet residential neighborhoods that Rodriguez patrolled during his graveyard shifts, other survivors of systematic abuse were living with psychological damage that made them vulnerable to continued exploitation. The darkness that came out at night included predators who specialized in identifying and targeting people whose previous victimization had created the specific psychological vulnerabilities they knew how to manipulate. And somewhere in Riverside, other perpetrators were developing elaborate justifications for systematic torture, convincing themselves and their victims that inflicting pain was actually providing care, love, or medical treatment. The graveyard shift continued night after night, with officers responding to calls that sometimes revealed crimes so psychologically sophisticated that the victims couldn't understand they were being victimized until years of systematic abuse had created psychological damage that might never fully heal. Officer Jennifer Clark had been walking the graveyard shift beat in Sacramento's Elmhurst neighborhood for 11 years, and she developed an intuitive sense for when something was wrong in the quiet residential area she patrolled on foot during the darkest hours of the night. The 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. walking beat brought her into intimate contact with the rhythm of sleeping families, the sounds that carried through thin apartment walls, and the subtle changes in routine that could signal everything from domestic violence to burglary in progress. But as she made her regular rounds through Fairytale Park, checking playground equipment, and ensuring that the recreational area remained safe for the children who would arrive with the morning sun. She had no idea that her attention to a seemingly minor detail would begin to unravel a mystery that had been developing in her patrol area for months, without anyone recognizing the pattern that connected seemingly unrelated incidents. The park was located in the heart of a working-class neighborhood, where single mothers and immigrant families raised their children in small apartments surrounding the only green space for several blocks. Jennifer had walked this beat long enough to know the normal sounds and sights of the area during overnight hours. Which apartment windows showed late-night television viewing, which teenagers gathered at the basketball court after dark, and which homeless individuals sought shelter in the park's covered picnic areas during cold weather. At exactly 3:26 a.m., as Jennifer conducted her routine security check of the playground equipment, she noticed something that violated the established pattern of how the park appeared during her nightly visits. A child's bicycle was chained to the monkey bars in the center of the playground, secured with a combination lock, and positioned as if someone had deliberately placed it there to be discovered. Jennifer had never seen the bicycle before during her 11 years of overnight patrols, and its presence at 3:26 a.m. was deeply concerning, because children didn't ride bicycles to the park in the middle of the night, and parents didn't allow their children's bikes to remain unattended in a public area overnight. The bicycle appeared to be in good condition, suggesting it belonged to a child whose family cared about maintaining their belongings, which made its abandonment in the park even more unusual. The bicycle was small, probably sized for a child between 8 and 10 years old, and it was bright red with decorative streamers attached to the handlebars. Jennifer could see that it had been secured to the monkey bars with care, using a good quality combination lock that suggested someone had taken time to ensure the bicycle wouldn't be stolen while it remained in the park. Jennifer approached the bicycle carefully and began documenting its appearance and location, following department protocol for investigating abandoned property that might be connected to criminal activity or missing persons. As she examined the bicycle more closely, she found details that transformed her concern about an abandoned bike into alarm about a potentially missing child. Attached to the bicycle's handlebar was a small backpack that contained school supplies, a lunchbox with food that appeared fresh, and a folder of homework assignments with the child's name written in careful elementary school handwriting. The homework was dated for the previous day and appeared to be completed, suggesting that the bicycle's owner had been preparing for a normal school day when something had interrupted their routine. The name on the homework assignments was Emma Martinez, Grade 3, Mrs. Peterson's class. Jennifer immediately recognized that she was potentially looking at evidence connected to a missing child case, and she began following department procedures for documenting and investigating circumstances that might involve child endangerment or abduction. Jennifer radioed dispatch to report her discovery and request guidance on investigating the abandoned bicycle and its contents. Unit 7, I have located an unattended child's bicycle in Fairytale Park that appears to belong to Emma Martinez, approximately 8 to 10 years old. The bicycle is secured with a lock and contains school materials suggesting the child was preparing for normal activities, requesting Detective Division and Missing Persons to determine if this child has been reported missing. Copy Unit 7, checking Missing Persons database for Emma Martinez. Stand by for information. As Jennifer waited for information from dispatch, she continued examining the area around the bicycle for any additional evidence that might provide clues about how it had come to be abandoned in the park during overnight hours. The playground appeared otherwise normal, with no signs of struggle or disturbance that would indicate violence or forced abduction. However, as Jennifer expanded her search to include the area surrounding the playground, she began to notice other details that suggested the bicycle's presence might be part of a larger pattern of unusual activity in the park during overnight hours. Near the picnic area, Jennifer found evidence that someone had been spending time in the park during hours when it should have been empty. There were fresh food wrappers, drink containers, and what appeared to be a small camping chair that had been concealed behind the public restrooms. The evidence suggested that someone had been using the park as a regular gathering place during overnight hours. More concerning, Jennifer found what appeared to be additional children's belongings scattered in different areas of the park. A small jacket hanging from a tree branch near the basketball court, a pair of child's shoes placed neatly beside a park bench, and a stuffed animal positioned on top of the picnic table closest to the playground equipment. The children's belongings appeared to have been placed deliberately rather than dropped accidentally, and their distribution throughout different areas of the park suggested that someone had been collecting and displaying children's items in a way that created a disturbing pattern of child-related objects in locations where no children should have been present during overnight hours. Jennifer's radio crackled with information from dispatch that confirmed her growing concern about the significance of what she had discovered. Unit 7. We have a missing person report filed at 11:47 p.m. yesterday for Emma Martinez, age 9, reported missing by her mother when the child failed to return home from school. Description matches the school materials you've located. The confirmation that Emma Martinez was a missing child transformed Jennifer's investigation from abandoned property to potential evidence in an active abduction case. Jennifer immediately secured the area and requested that Detective Division and Crime Scene Investigation respond to document and analyze the evidence she had discovered. Unit 7 requesting immediate detective and CSI response to Fairy Tale Park. I have located evidence potentially connected to Emma Martinez missing child case, including bicycle, personal belongings, and additional children's items that suggest a pattern of activity requiring investigation. Copy Unit 7. Detective Rodriguez and CSI team en route. ETA 12 minutes. Secure the scene and document everything without disturbing potential evidence. As Jennifer waited for Detective Division to arrive, she continued her systematic examination of the park and began to recognize that what she had initially thought was a single abandoned bicycle was actually evidence of a much more disturbing pattern of activity involving multiple children's belongings distributed throughout the recreational area. The children's items she had found were all clean, in good condition, and appeared to have been placed deliberately rather than lost or abandoned accidentally. Someone had been collecting children's belongings and arranging them throughout the park in a way that suggested either a deeply disturbed individual or someone who was using the items to send a message or create a specific psychological effect. Jennifer's 11 years of walking the graveyard shift had taught her to recognize when seemingly unrelated details formed patterns that indicated serious criminal activity. The distribution of children's belongings throughout Fairy Tale Park during overnight hours, combined with the missing child report for Emma Martinez, suggested that someone had been using the park for activities involving children during hours when legitimate family use of the recreational area would not occur. The graveyard shift was supposed to involve routine patrol of a quiet residential neighborhood where families slept peacefully in their apartments and children remained safely in their beds until morning brought them to the park for legitimate recreational activities. Instead, Jennifer's routine patrol had uncovered evidence suggesting that someone had been using the overnight hours to engage in activities involving children that created patterns of evidence requiring immediate investigation by specialists in crimes against children. As Detective Rodriguez arrived to take over the investigation, Jennifer realized that her discovery of Emma Martinez's bicycle had potentially uncovered evidence of predatory activity targeting children in a neighborhood where families believed their children were safe and protected. The overnight hours that Jennifer patrolled to ensure community safety had been used by someone to engage in activities that threatened the most vulnerable members of the community she was sworn to protect. Detective Luis Rodriguez had been investigating crimes against children for 9 years. and he immediately recognized that Officer Clark's discovery in Fairy Tale Park represented evidence of predatory behavior that exceeded simple child abduction. As he examined the children's belongings that had been distributed throughout the park, Rodriguez realized that he was looking at what appeared to be a collection that had been assembled over an extended period of time. Officer Clark, you've uncovered what appears to be evidence of systematic predatory activity targeting children in this neighborhood, Rodriguez explained as he began documenting the locations and condition of each item Jennifer had found. The deliberate placement and preservation of these belongings suggests someone who has been collecting children's items as trophies or for some other psychological purpose. Jennifer accompanied Rodriguez as he conducted a systematic search of the entire park, using crime scene investigation techniques to document every piece of evidence and analyze the pattern of how the items had been distributed throughout the recreational area. The crime scene investigation revealed that the children's belongings had been placed according to a specific pattern that suggested psychological significance for whoever had created the display. The items were arranged in a rough circle around the playground equipment, with Emma Martinez's bicycle positioned at the center like an altar or focal point for the collection. This arrangement suggests someone who views the park as their personal space and is using children's belongings to create some kind of shrine or display, Rodriguez observed as he photographed the evidence and documented the relationships between different items. We're dealing with someone who has a psychological fixation on children that has motivated them to create this collection. The systematic examination of the children's belongings revealed that they had been collected from multiple sources over what appeared to be several months. Some items showed signs of weathering that suggested they had been exposed to outdoor conditions for extended periods, while others appeared fresh and recently placed. Rodriguez found evidence that the person responsible for creating the collection had been spending considerable time in the park during overnight hours, possibly conducting surveillance of the surrounding neighborhood and identifying children whose belongings could be acquired for addition to the display. Officer Clark, based on what we're seeing here, I believe we're dealing with someone who has been operating in this area for months, possibly years, Rodriguez explained. The number of items and the systematic way they've been arranged suggest a level of planning and obsession that indicates serious psychological disorder and potential danger to children. The investigation revealed that the children's items represented at least 8 different children, based on size variations, style differences, and condition factors that suggested they had been acquired at different times from different sources. The scope of the collection indicated that Emma Martinez was not the first child to have been targeted by whoever was responsible for the display. Rodriguez coordinated with the department's Missing Persons Division to cross-reference the children's items found in the park with reports of missing children, lost property, and suspicious activity in the surrounding neighborhoods. The investigation would need to determine whether the items had been taken from children who had subsequently disappeared, or whether they represented property theft that might indicate stalking or surveillance of potential victims. We need to assume that whoever created this collection has been targeting children in the surrounding area and may have escalated from collecting belongings to more serious crimes, Rodriguez told Jennifer as they continued documenting evidence. Emma Martinez's disappearance in connection with this collection suggests that the person responsible may have moved beyond property theft to actual abduction. The crime scene investigation also revealed evidence that the park had been used for activities beyond simply displaying children's belongings. Rodriguez found indications that someone had been camping in the park during overnight hours, possibly conducting extended surveillance of the surrounding neighborhood to identify children and their routines. Hidden behind the public restrooms, Rodriguez discovered a more elaborate campsite than Jennifer had initially observed. The area contained camping equipment, food supplies, and surveillance materials, including binoculars, notebooks with what appeared to be observations about neighborhood children, and photographs of local children engaged in normal playground activities. Officer Clark were looking at evidence of systematic surveillance and stalking of children in this neighborhood, Rodriguez reported as he examined the hidden surveillance materials. Whoever is responsible has been conducting detailed observation of local children and documenting their activities and routines. The surveillance materials included detailed notes about specific children, their schedules, their families' routines, and their use of the park during normal daytime hours. The level of detail suggested that the person responsible had been conducting systematic stalking of multiple children while identifying potential victims for whatever purposes they had planned. Rodriguez found photographs that showed children playing in the park during normal daytime hours, with some images focused on specific children who appeared to have been targeted for special attention. The photographs were date-stamped and organized in a way that suggested the person responsible had been maintaining detailed records of their surveillance activities. This level of systematic surveillance and documentation suggests someone who has been planning to escalate beyond collecting belongings to direct contact with children, Rodriguez concluded as he analyzed the evidence. The surveillance materials indicate preparation for activities that would require detailed knowledge of children's routines and vulnerabilities. The investigation revealed that the person responsible had been focusing particular attention on children who use the park regularly during after-school hours, documenting their activities and identifying patterns that could be used to predict when specific children would be vulnerable to approach or abduction. Rodriguez found evidence that Emma Martinez had been under surveillance for several weeks before her disappearance, with multiple photographs showing her playing in the park and detailed notes about her routine of riding her bicycle to the playground after school. The materials suggested that her abduction had been planned in advance based on systematic observation of her activities. Emma Martinez was specifically targeted based on surveillance that documented her routine use of this park, Rodriguez realized as he analyzed the surveillance materials. Her disappearance wasn't random. It was the result of systematic stalking and planning by someone who had been watching her for weeks. The crime scene investigation expanded to include the surrounding neighborhood as Rodriguez worked to identify additional evidence of surveillance and stalking activities that might reveal the scope of the threat to local children. The investigation would need to determine whether other children in the area were also being targeted and whether additional abductions might have occurred without being reported or recognized. Rodriguez coordinated with patrol units to conduct welfare checks on children identified in the surveillance materials, ensuring that other potential victims were safe, while also gathering information about any suspicious activity their families might have observed in the neighborhood. "We need to treat this as an active threat to multiple children in this area," Rodriguez explained to the patrol officers who were assisting with the expanded investigation. "The evidence suggests systematic predatory behavior that poses immediate danger to any child who uses this park or lives in the surrounding neighborhood." The investigation had transformed from a missing child case to a comprehensive operation, targeting what appeared to be a systematic predator who had been operating in the neighborhood for months while conducting surveillance and collecting trophies in preparation for escalating criminal activities against children. Jennifer realized that her routine graveyard shift patrol had uncovered evidence of predatory activity that had been occurring in a neighborhood where families believed their children were safe to play and attend school. The overnight hours that she patrolled to ensure community safety had been used by someone to conduct surveillance and stalking that threatened the most vulnerable members of the community. The children's belongings that had been arranged throughout Fairytale Park represented evidence of systematic predatory behavior that indicated planning and preparation for activities that could result in serious harm to local children. The discovery of Emma Martinez's bicycle had revealed a threat that required immediate response to protect other potential victims and locate a missing child who might still be saved if law enforcement could identify and apprehend the person responsible quickly enough. As dawn approached and Detective Rodriguez continued processing the crime scene at Fairy Tale Park, Officer Clark received a radio call that would reveal the most disturbing aspect of the predatory activity that had been discovered. A resident in one of the apartment buildings overlooking the park was reporting that she had been observing suspicious activity in the recreational area during overnight hours for several weeks, but had not reported it because she wasn't sure whether what she was seeing was actually criminal behavior. Unit 7. Respond to 847 Maple Street, Apartment 3B. Caller states she has information about suspicious overnight activity in Fairy Tale Park that may be related to your current investigation. Jennifer left Detective Rodriguez to continue processing the crime scene and responded to the apartment building where she would gather information that would reveal the systematic nature of the predatory activity and provide crucial intelligence about the person responsible for Emma Martinez's disappearance. 847 Maple Street was a 3-story apartment building that directly overlooked Fairy Tale Park, with balconies and windows that provided clear views of the playground equipment and surrounding recreational areas. Jennifer was met by Maria Santos, a 34-year-old single mother who worked as a night shift nurse and had been observing unusual activity in the park during the hours when she returned home from work. "Officer, I've been seeing someone in the park almost every night for the past month, always between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., Maria explained as she led Jennifer to her apartment balcony, which provided a clear view of the area where the children's belongings had been discovered. "At first, I thought it might be a homeless person camping there, but the behavior I've been observing is much more disturbing than that." Maria's account revealed that she had been witnessing systematic surveillance and stalking behavior that confirmed Detective Rodriguez's analysis of the evidence found in the park. The person responsible had been conducting regular overnight operations in the recreational area, while most residents were asleep and unaware of the predatory activity occurring in their neighborhood. "The person I've been seeing spends hours arranging and rearranging objects throughout the park, always focusing on the playground equipment area," Maria continued. "They move very deliberately and seem to be following some kind of ritual or pattern that they repeat night after night." Jennifer documented Maria's observations while coordinating with Detective Rodriguez to ensure that the witness information was integrated with the physical evidence analysis. Maria's account provided crucial intelligence about the operational patterns of the person responsible for the children's collection and Emma Martinez's disappearance. "Can you describe the person you've been observing?" Jennifer asked, recognizing that Maria's witness testimony might provide the first description of the suspect in the case. "It's difficult to see details from this distance, especially at night, but I can tell you that it's definitely an adult, probably male based on body size and movement patterns," Maria replied. "They wear dark clothing and seem very familiar with the park layout, moving around without any hesitation or need to use artificial light." Maria's observation about the suspect's familiarity with the park confirmed that the predatory activity had been conducted by someone who had extensive knowledge of the area and had been operating there for an extended period. The systematic nature of the behavior suggested someone who had developed detailed plans and routines for conducting surveillance and collecting evidence while avoiding detection. "Officer, there's something else that's been bothering me about what I've observed," Maria continued. "The person doesn't just arrange objects in the park, they also spend time watching the apartment buildings around the park, as if they're studying the residents and learning about our routines." The revelation that the suspect had been conducting surveillance of the residential area surrounding the park added another dimension to the threat, and suggested that the predatory activity extended beyond targeting children who use the recreational facilities to include studying the families who lived in the neighborhood. Jennifer realized that the suspect had been gathering intelligence about the entire community, identifying children who lived in the area, and learning about family routines that could be used to predict when children would be vulnerable to approach or abduction. Maria, have you noticed any particular attention to specific apartments or families? Jennifer asked, thinking about the surveillance materials that Detective Rodriguez had found hidden in the park. Yes, and that's what made me finally decide to call, Maria replied. For the past week, the person has been spending most of their time focused on the playground equipment and the apartment buildings where families with young children live. It seemed like they were studying specific families and learning about their schedules. Maria's observations confirmed that Emma Martinez's abduction had been the result of systematic surveillance and planning, rather than a random, opportunistic crime. The suspect had been conducting intelligence-gathering operations that allowed them to identify potential victims and plan their approach based on detailed knowledge of children's routines and family schedules. Jennifer coordinated with Detective Rodriguez to expand the investigation to include all apartment buildings overlooking the park, recognizing that additional witnesses might have observed the suspect's surveillance activities and could provide information crucial for identifying and apprehending the person responsible. Detective Rodriguez, we have a witness who has been observing systematic surveillance activity in the park area for approximately 1 month, Jennifer radioed. The suspect has been conducting regular overnight operations and has been focusing surveillance on apartment buildings where families with children reside. Copy Unit 7. I'm finding additional evidence that confirms systematic surveillance and stalking. We need to treat this as an immediate threat to all children in the surrounding area and expand our investigation to identify additional potential victims. The witness information provided by Maria Santos revealed that the predatory activity had been conducted with a level of systematic planning and surveillance that exceeded what would be expected from typical predatory behavior. The suspect had been operating like an intelligence professional, conducting detailed surveillance and analysis before selecting targets and planning their approach. Jennifer's investigation expanded to include interviews with additional residents of the apartment buildings overlooking the park, gathering information about any suspicious activity or approaches to children that might have been observed during the period when the suspect had been conducting surveillance operations. The expanded investigation revealed that several families had noticed unusual attention to their children during recent weeks, including adults who had attempted to engage children in conversation near the park, and individuals who had been observed watching children's activities from positions that provided concealment and extended observation opportunities. We're dealing with someone who has been conducting systematic intelligence gathering and surveillance in preparation for predatory activities targeting multiple children, Jennifer reported to Detective Rodriguez as the investigation revealed the scope of the threat. The evidence suggests planning and preparation that indicates serious intent to harm children in this neighborhood. The investigation had revealed that Emma Martinez's disappearance was part of a systematic campaign of predatory activity that had been developing for months and represented an immediate threat to all children in the surrounding area. The overnight hours that Jennifer patrolled to ensure community safety had been used by a predator to conduct surveillance and intelligence gathering in preparation for activities that threatened the most vulnerable members of the community. The children's collection found in Fairytale Park represented evidence of systematic stalking and surveillance that had culminated in the abduction of at least one child, and potentially indicated planning for additional crimes against other children in the neighborhood. As Jennifer Clark's graveyard shift was officially ending, and day shift officers were beginning their patrol duties, Detective Rodriguez made a discovery at Fairytale Park that would transform the investigation from a missing child case into something far more disturbing. Hidden beneath the playground equipment, Rodriguez found evidence of an underground space that had been excavated and used for purposes that exceeded simple surveillance and collection of children's belongings. Officer Clark, before you end your shift, I need you to see what we found beneath the playground, Rodriguez called as Jennifer was preparing to leave the scene. The investigation has revealed evidence that suggests the predatory activity has been much more extensive than we initially realized. Jennifer returned to the park where crime scene investigators had uncovered a hidden entrance to an underground chamber that had been excavated beneath the playground equipment. The entrance was concealed by removable sections of playground flooring that could be lifted to reveal a ladder leading down into a space that appeared to have been used for extended periods. The underground chamber appears to have been used as a base of operations for surveillance and potentially for holding victims, Rodriguez explained, as he prepared to examine the underground space. The level of excavation and construction suggests someone who has been planning these activities for a very long time. The underground chamber was larger and more sophisticated than anything that could have been created quickly or without extensive planning and resources. The space contained lighting, ventilation, and furnishings that suggested it had been designed for extended occupation and possibly for holding people against their will. Jennifer descended into the underground chamber and immediately recognized that she was looking at evidence of predatory activity that exceeded anything in her 11 years of law enforcement experience. The chamber contained restraints, surveillance equipment, and living accommodations that suggested it had been designed for holding and monitoring victims over extended periods. Detective Rodriguez, this appears to be designed as a holding facility for kidnapped children, Jennifer observed as she examined the restraints and monitoring equipment. Someone has created an underground prison beneath a children's playground. The underground chamber contained multiple areas that appeared to serve different functions. A surveillance center with monitors showing live feeds from hidden cameras positioned throughout the park and surrounding neighborhood. A storage area containing additional children's belongings that had been collected over an extended period, and a living area with restraints and furnishings designed for holding victims. Rodriguez documented the underground facility while coordinating with federal authorities who would need to be involved in investigating what appeared to be a sophisticated child abduction and imprisonment operation. The scope and sophistication of the facility suggested resources and planning capabilities that exceeded what local law enforcement typically encountered. Officer Clark, the federal authorities are treating this as a potential child trafficking operation, Rodriguez reported as FBI agents arrived to take over portions of the investigation. The underground facility and surveillance equipment suggest an operation designed for systematic abduction and imprisonment of children. The investigation of the underground chamber revealed evidence that multiple children had been held in the facility over an extended period. The chamber contained personal belongings, clothing, and other evidence suggesting that Emma Martinez was not the first child to have been imprisoned in the space beneath the playground. FBI agent Sarah Martinez coordinated with local law enforcement to expand the investigation and determine the scope of the child abduction and trafficking operation that had been discovered. The underground facility represented evidence of systematic predatory activity that required federal resources and expertise to investigate fully. Detective Rodriguez, preliminary analysis of the evidence suggests this facility has been used to hold multiple children over at least a 6-month period, Agent Martinez reported. We're looking at evidence of systematic child trafficking that may be connected to broader criminal networks. The investigation revealed that the underground facility had been equipped with technology for monitoring and recording the activities of imprisoned children, suggesting that the operation might have been designed for producing illegal materials or for other commercial exploitation of child victims. Jennifer learned that the surveillance equipment found in the underground chamber had been used to monitor not just the imprisoned children, but also the park and surrounding neighborhood to identify additional potential victims and track the activities of law enforcement and other adults who might pose threats to the operation. The sophistication of this operation suggests connections to organized criminal networks with resources and expertise that exceed individual predatory behavior, Agent Martinez explained to Jennifer and Detective Rodriguez. We're treating this as evidence of systematic child trafficking rather than isolated predatory activity. The federal investigation revealed that the underground facility beneath Fairytale Park was connected to similar operations in other cities, forming part of a network designed for systematic abduction, imprisonment, and exploitation of children. The operation represented threats to child safety that extended far beyond the local neighborhood where it had been discovered. Rodriguez coordinated with federal authorities to determine whether Emma Martinez and other children who had been held in the underground facility were still alive and could be rescued, or whether the investigation would focus on identifying and prosecuting the criminal network responsible for the trafficking operation. The evidence suggests that children held in this facility were eventually moved to other locations, possibly for sale or exploitation, Agent Martinez reported. Emma Martinez may still be alive, but is likely no longer in the local area. The investigation had revealed that Jennifer's discovery of the children's collection in Fairytale Park had uncovered evidence of systematic child trafficking that represented one of the most serious criminal operations that federal authorities had encountered. The underground facility beneath the playground had been used for imprisoning and exploiting children in a neighborhood where families believed their children were safe and protected. Jennifer realized that her routine graveyard shift patrol had uncovered evidence of criminal activity that threatened children throughout the region and possibly the country. The overnight hours that she had patrolled to ensure community safety had been used by criminal networks to conduct systematic abduction and trafficking of children. The children's belongings that had been arranged throughout the park represented trophies from victims who had been processed through the underground facility and sold or transferred to other criminal operations. Emma Martinez's bicycle had been placed at the center of the collection to mark her as the most recent victim to be processed through the trafficking operation. Federal authorities, coordinating the expanded investigation, had identified similar operations in multiple cities, revealing a criminal network that had been systematically abducting and trafficking children while using underground facilities to avoid detection by law enforcement. Officer Clark, your discovery has led to the identification of a child trafficking network that has been operating in multiple states, Agent Martinez told Jennifer as the federal investigation expanded. The underground facility you found has provided crucial evidence for disrupting criminal operations that have victimized dozens of children. Jennifer ended her graveyard shift, knowing that her routine patrol had uncovered one of the most serious threats to child safety that law enforcement could encounter. The peaceful neighborhood park where children played during the day had been hiding an underground facility used for imprisoning and trafficking kidnapped children. The investigation would continue for months as federal authorities worked to identify all victims of the trafficking network and locate children who might still be imprisoned in similar facilities in other cities. Emma Martinez's disappearance had revealed criminal activity that threatened children throughout the country and required ongoing investigation to protect future potential victims. 6 hours after Jennifer Clark's graveyard shift had ended, federal investigators made discoveries at the Fairytale Park underground facility that would reveal the most disturbing truth about the child trafficking operation and demonstrate that Emma Martinez's abduction was part of a systematic criminal enterprise that extended far beyond what local law enforcement could handle. FBI agent Martinez called Jennifer back to the park to brief her on discoveries that federal investigators were describing as evidence of one of the most extensive child trafficking networks ever uncovered in the United States. Officer Clark, what we found in the underground facility goes beyond individual criminal behavior and represents systematic commercial exploitation of children on a scale that requires federal resources and international cooperation to address. Jennifer returned to find Fairytale Park transformed into a major federal crime scene with dozens of agents, technical specialists, and child protection experts analyzing evidence that revealed the true scope of the criminal network that had been operating beneath the playground. The expanded investigation of the underground facility had revealed that it was connected to a sophisticated network of similar installations throughout the western United States, forming part of a commercial operation designed for systematic abduction, processing, and distribution of children for various forms of exploitation. Officer Clark, the underground facility you discovered has been operating as a processing center for a child trafficking network that includes operations in at least 12 other cities, Agent Martinez explained, as Jennifer was briefed on the discoveries that had been made. The children held here were being prepared for transfer to other locations where they would be sold or exploited commercially. Detective Rodriguez joined the briefing and learned that the surveillance materials found in the underground facility had been used not just to identify local victims, but to gather intelligence for the broader trafficking network about law enforcement activities, community patterns, and potential threats to their operations. The surveillance operation was designed to ensure that the trafficking network could operate without detection, while also identifying law enforcement personnel and community members who might pose threats to their activities, Rodriguez learned from federal investigators. The investigation revealed that the child trafficking network had been operating for over 3 years and had processed hundreds of children through facilities like the one found beneath Fairy Tale Park. The network had developed sophisticated methods for identifying, abducting, and processing victims while avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies. Federal investigators analyzing evidence from the underground facility discovered that the trafficking network operated like a commercial business, with specialized roles for different participants and systematic approaches to victim acquisition, processing, and distribution. The network includes people responsible for surveillance and victim identification, others who handle abduction and initial processing, and specialists who manage transportation and final placement of victims, Agent Martinez explained. It's organized like a legitimate business operation, but focused on the systematic exploitation of children. Jennifer learned that the person responsible for creating the children's collection and abducting Emma Martinez was part of a larger criminal organization that included dozens of participants with different specialized functions. The individual predatory behavior that had initially appeared to be the work of a single disturbed person was actually part of a systematic commercial operation. The federal investigation revealed that the trafficking network had been targeting children from specific demographic groups and geographic areas based on market demands from customers who purchased children for various forms of exploitation. The network operated according to supply and demand principles, with different types of children being acquired based on customer specifications. The trafficking network operates according to orders from customers who specify the types of children they want to purchase, Agent Martinez explained. Emma Martinez was targeted because she matched specifications that had been provided by customers for children with her physical characteristics and background. The commercial nature of the trafficking operation meant that Emma Martinez and other children had been abducted not for the personal gratification of individual predators, but as products to be sold to customers who purchased children for exploitation purposes. Rodriguez learned that the trafficking network had been using sophisticated communication and coordination systems to manage their operations across multiple cities while avoiding detection by law enforcement. The network included participants with expertise in security, transportation, and financial operations that allowed them to function like a legitimate business organization. The network includes former law enforcement and military personnel who provide security and counter-surveillance expertise, transportation specialists who manage victim movement between facilities, and financial experts who handle money laundering and payment processing, federal investigators revealed. The investigation had uncovered evidence that some law enforcement and government officials had been providing protection and intelligence to the trafficking network in exchange for financial payments. The corruption investigation would extend the case beyond criminal trafficking to include official misconduct and conspiracy charges against public officials. Officer Clark, the trafficking network includes corrupted officials who have been providing protection and advance warning about law enforcement activities, Agent Martinez told Jennifer. Your discovery has exposed corruption that reaches into law enforcement and government agencies at multiple levels. The corruption investigation revealed that the trafficking network had been operating with inside information about law enforcement activities, allowing them to avoid detection and continue their operations, despite ongoing investigations by agencies that were unaware their activities were being monitored and compromised. Jennifer realized that her graveyard shift discovery had uncovered not just child trafficking, but systematic corruption that had been protecting criminal operations and preventing law enforcement from protecting vulnerable children. The federal investigation expanded to include internal affairs, investigations of law enforcement agencies, and comprehensive reviews of government officials who might have been providing protection to the trafficking network. The corruption we've uncovered explains how this trafficking network was able to operate for years without being detected, despite the scope and visibility of their activities, Rodriguez learned from federal investigators. The investigation revealed that the trafficking network had been paying corrupted officials to provide advance warning about law enforcement activities, intelligence about investigation priorities, and protection from prosecution when their operations were discovered. Federal authorities coordinating the expanded investigation had identified corrupted officials in law enforcement agencies, child protective services, and government administration who had been facilitating the trafficking network's operations while preventing effective investigation and prosecution of their activities. The trafficking network couldn't have operated at this scale without systematic corruption and protection from officials who were supposed to be protecting children, Agent Martinez concluded. Jennifer learned that her discovery of Emma Martinez's bicycle had led to the exposure of a corruption that had been preventing law enforcement from effectively protecting children and prosecuting trafficking operations. The investigation would require comprehensive reform of law enforcement and child protection agencies to eliminate the corruption that had been protecting trafficking networks and preventing effective protection of vulnerable children. Officer Clark, your graveyard shift patrol has uncovered systematic corruption and criminal activity that threatens the fundamental ability of law enforcement to protect children, Agent Martinez told Jennifer. The peaceful neighborhood where Jennifer had conducted routine patrols had been harboring criminal operations that were protected by corrupted officials who had been preventing effective law enforcement response to threats against children. 12 hours after the discovery of the underground facility at Fairytale Park, federal investigators received intelligence that would lead to a coordinated rescue operation designed to locate and recover Emma Martinez and other children who had been processed through the trafficking network. The information came from interrogation of suspects arrested at similar facilities in other cities, providing crucial intelligence about the network's operational structure and victim distribution systems. Agent Martinez coordinated with Jennifer Clark and Detective Rodriguez to brief them on the rescue operation that would attempt to locate Emma Martinez and the other victims before they could be permanently disappeared into the trafficking network's distribution system. Officer Clark, we've identified the location where Emma Martinez and other children from this facility are being held pending final disposition, Agent Martinez explained during the briefing. The rescue operation will require coordination between federal agencies, local law enforcement, and specialized teams trained in child recovery operations. The intelligence revealed that children processed through the Fairytale Park facility were being held at a remote compound approximately 60 miles outside Sacramento, where they were kept in holding areas while the trafficking network arranged final placement with customers or transportation to other distribution points. Jennifer learned that the rescue operation would involve simultaneous raids on multiple facilities identified through the federal investigation, with the goal of recovering as many trafficked children as possible while disrupting the network's operations throughout the western United States. The compound, where Emma Martinez is being held, contains approximately 25 children who have been processed through facilities like the one you discovered, Agent Martinez explained. The rescue operation represents our best opportunity to recover these children before they are permanently disappeared into the trafficking system. Detective Rodriguez joined the briefing team that would coordinate with federal tactical units conducting the rescue operation. The complexity of the operation required careful planning to ensure that children could be recovered safely while preventing trafficking network personnel from escaping or destroying evidence. The trafficking network includes armed security personnel who have been instructed to eliminate evidence, including victims if the facilities are discovered by law enforcement, federal investigators warned. The rescue operation must be conducted with precision to prevent harm to the children being held at the compound. Jennifer was assigned to assist with victim identification and support during the rescue operation, providing her knowledge of the Fairy Tale Park investigation to help identify Emma Martinez and other children who might have been processed through the facility she had discovered. The rescue operation launched at exactly 6:47 p.m. with coordinated raids on 7 different facilities identified through the federal investigation. Jennifer accompanied federal tactical teams to the compound where Emma Martinez and other children were believed to be held. The compound was located in a remote area that provided isolation and concealment for the trafficking network's operations, while also making law enforcement approach difficult and easily detected. The facility included multiple buildings designed for holding victims, processing areas for preparing children for transportation, and security systems designed to prevent escape and detect law enforcement presence. Federal tactical teams conducted a simultaneous assault on all buildings in the compound, while Jennifer and other investigators prepared to provide immediate assistance to recovered children who would require medical attention and psychological support after their ordeal. The rescue operation successfully recovered 23 children ranging in age from 6 to 14 years old, including Emma Martinez, who was found in a holding area where children were kept while awaiting final disposition by the trafficking network. Officer Clark, we've found Emma Martinez. Agent Martinez radioed as the tactical operation secured the compound. She's alive and conscious but will require immediate medical attention and specialized care to address the trauma she's experienced. Jennifer was reunited with Emma Martinez during the initial victim recovery phase of the operation, providing the continuity between her discovery of the child's bicycle and the successful rescue that had resulted from the investigation her graveyard shift patrol had initiated. Emma Martinez was physically unharmed, but showed signs of psychological trauma consistent with prolonged captivity and exposure to the threatening environment of the trafficking operation. Her recovery represented a successful outcome for the investigation that had begun with Jennifer's observation of an abandoned bicycle in Fairy Tale Park. "Emma, you're safe now," Jennifer told the child, as medical personnel prepared her for transport to a specialized facility equipped to provide care for trafficking victims. "Your mom has been waiting for you, and we're going to make sure you get home safely." The rescue operation also recovered 22 other children who had been processed through trafficking facilities similar to the one discovered beneath Fairy Tale Park. The children represented victims from multiple states who had been abducted and processed through the network's systematic exploitation operations. Federal investigators conducting the rescue operation arrested 17 trafficking network personnel at the compound, including individuals responsible for security, victim processing, and coordination with other network facilities. The arrests at this compound have provided crucial intelligence about the trafficking network's operations and have led to the identification of additional facilities and personnel, Agent Martinez reported, as the rescue operation concluded successfully. The successful recovery of Emma Martinez and the other children represented a significant victory against systematic child trafficking, but federal investigators emphasized that the network's operations extended beyond what had been discovered and would require ongoing investigation to completely dismantle. Jennifer's role in the rescue operation provided closure for the investigation that had begun with her routine graveyard shift patrol, demonstrating how individual police work could lead to major federal operations that saved the lives of vulnerable children. Officer Clark, your observation of an abandoned bicycle has led to the rescue of 23 trafficked children and the disruption of criminal operations that threatened children throughout the western United States, Agent Martinez told Jennifer as the rescue operation concluded. The investigation had revealed that routine police work during graveyard shift patrols could uncover evidence of the most serious threats to community safety and child protection. Jennifer's attention to details that violated normal patterns had led to discoveries that saved children's lives and disrupted criminal networks. Emma Martinez was reunited with her family after receiving medical evaluation and initial counseling to address the trauma of her captivity. Her recovery represented hope for other families whose children had been victimized by trafficking networks, and demonstrated that effective law enforcement could successfully rescue victims and disrupt criminal operations. The investigation would continue for months as federal authorities worked to dismantle the complete trafficking network and identify all victims and perpetrators involved in the systematic exploitation of children. 2 weeks after the successful rescue operation, Jennifer Clark was back on her regular graveyard shift patrol when federal investigators contacted her with disturbing information about discoveries they had made while analyzing evidence from the trafficking network facilities. Agent Martinez called Jennifer to inform her that the investigation had revealed connections to additional criminal activities that extended far beyond child trafficking. Officer Clark, the trafficking network we disrupted was only one component of a much larger criminal enterprise that includes operations we are still working to understand. Agent Martinez explained during a briefing that would reveal the most disturbing truth about what Jennifer's graveyard shift discovery had uncovered. Jennifer learned that analysis of evidence from the underground facility at Fairytale Park and the compound where the children had been rescued had revealed connections to criminal networks involved in multiple forms of exploitation and illegal activities that posed threats extending beyond child trafficking. The trafficking network was operating as part of a comprehensive criminal enterprise that includes organ trafficking, forced labor operations, and international smuggling activities, Agent Martinez revealed. The children were being processed not just for sexual exploitation, but for various forms of commercial use, including organ harvesting and forced labor. The revelation that the criminal network had been involved in organ trafficking added a horrifying dimension to Emma Martinez's ordeal and the experiences of other children who had been processed through the system Jennifer had discovered. Detective Rodriguez joined the briefing and learned that some children processed through the trafficking network had been selected for organ harvesting operations rather than traditional forms of exploitation, representing a level of criminal activity that exceeded what law enforcement typically encountered. The network includes medical personnel who have been conducting organ harvesting operations on children who were determined to be suitable donors for customers who purchase organs for transplantation, federal investigators revealed. The organ trafficking operations explained some of the medical equipment and facilities that had been found in the underground installations, which had initially been attributed to general medical support for trafficking operations, but were actually designed for surgical procedures. Jennifer realized that Emma Martinez's rescue had prevented her from becoming a victim of organ harvesting rather than sexual exploitation, representing an even more immediate threat to her life than what investigators had initially understood. The trafficking network was sorting children into different categories based on physical characteristics, medical compatibility, and market demand for various forms of exploitation, Agent Martinez explained. Emma Martinez was being evaluated for organ compatibility when the rescue operation occurred. The investigation revealed that the criminal network had been operating medical facilities disguised as legitimate businesses, where organ harvesting operations were conducted on trafficked children whose organs were sold to customers willing to pay premium prices for transplantation procedures. Federal investigators analyzing the network's financial records discovered that organ trafficking generated significantly more revenue than traditional forms of child exploitation, making it the primary focus of the criminal enterprise, despite the additional complexity and risks involved. The network was generating millions of dollars in revenue through organ trafficking operations that used trafficked children as involuntary donors, investigators revealed. The children were essentially being treated as sources of commercial organ supply. Jennifer learned that the surveillance and selection processes she had discovered at Fairytale Park were designed not just to identify children for abduction, but to evaluate their suitability for organ harvesting based on medical criteria and compatibility factors. The systematic surveillance was designed to gather medical and genetic information about potential victims to determine their value for organ trafficking operations, Agent Martinez explained. The investigation revealed that the criminal network included medical professionals who had been conducting compatibility testing and surgical procedures while maintaining legitimate medical practices that provided cover for their involvement in organ trafficking. Rodriguez learned that some of the medical personnel involved in the organ trafficking operations were practicing physicians who used their legitimate medical access to identify potential recipients and facilitate illegal transplantation procedures. The network includes surgeons, anesthesiologists, and other medical professionals who have been conducting organ harvesting and transplantation procedures while maintaining legitimate medical practices, federal investigators reported. The involvement of legitimate medical professionals in the organ trafficking operations meant that the criminal network had access to medical facilities, equipment, and expertise that allowed them to conduct sophisticated surgical procedures while maintaining the appearance of legitimate medical practice. Jennifer realized that her discovery of the children's collection at Fairytale Park had uncovered evidence of systematic organ trafficking that represented one of the most serious forms of criminal activity that law enforcement could encounter. The investigation expanded to include medical licensing boards, hospital administrations, and healthcare regulatory agencies that would need to identify and prosecute medical professionals involved in organ trafficking operations. Officer Clark, your graveyard shift discovery has led to the investigation of systematic organ trafficking that involves corrupted medical professionals and represents fundamental threats to medical ethics and patient safety, Agent Martinez told Jennifer. The federal investigation revealed that organ trafficking operations extended beyond the criminal network Jennifer had discovered to include international connections and customers who purchased organs for transplantation procedures conducted in multiple countries. The organ trafficking network includes international customers and medical facilities that have been conducting transplantation procedures using organs harvested from trafficked children, investigators revealed. The international dimensions of the organ trafficking operations required coordination with law enforcement and medical regulatory agencies in multiple countries to identify all participants and disrupt the complete network. Jennifer learned that Emma Martinez and the other rescued children would require extensive medical evaluation to determine whether they had been subjected to medical procedures or testing related to organ trafficking evaluation. The children recovered from the network will need comprehensive medical examination to identify any evidence of medical procedures and to ensure they receive appropriate treatment for any health issues resulting from their captivity, medical specialists explained. The investigation had revealed that Jennifer's routine graveyard shift patrol had uncovered evidence of systematic organ trafficking that represented one of the most serious threats to child safety and medical ethics that federal authorities had encountered. The peaceful neighborhood where Jennifer conducted her patrols had been harboring criminal operations that were processing children for organ harvesting while using legitimate medical facilities and professionals to conduct illegal transplantation procedures. 3 months after Emma Martinez's rescue, Officer Jennifer Clark was nearing the end of another graveyard shift when she received information that would demonstrate that some forms of evil were too extensive and well organized to be eliminated through individual investigations and arrests. Agent Martinez contacted Jennifer with disturbing intelligence about discoveries federal authorities had made while investigating the international connections of the organ trafficking network. Officer Clark, the network we disrupted was only one cell of a global organization that includes operations in over 30 countries, Agent Martinez explained, during what would be Jennifer's final briefing about the case that had begun with her discovery of a child's bicycle in Fairy Tale Park. The organ trafficking operations continued despite our arrests because the organization has redundant systems and backup facilities that allow them to resume operations when individual cells are disrupted. Jennifer learned that federal investigations in multiple countries had revealed that systematic organ trafficking using trafficked children was conducted by international criminal organizations with resources and capabilities that exceeded what any individual country's law enforcement could address comprehensively. The organization includes medical professionals, government officials, transportation specialists, and financial experts in dozens of countries who coordinate to provide organs for customers willing to pay premium prices for transplantation procedures, Agent Martinez revealed. The investigation had revealed that Emma Martinez's rescue and the disruption of the trafficking network had prevented immediate harm to specific victims, but had not eliminated the underlying criminal enterprise that continued to operate through other facilities and personnel. Detective Rodriguez joined Jennifer for the final briefing and learned that similar trafficking and organ harvesting operations had been identified in major cities throughout the United States and internationally, representing a form of systematic criminal activity that posed ongoing threats to children worldwide. We estimate that the global organization is processing thousands of children annually through organ trafficking operations that generate hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, federal investigators reported. The scope of the international organ trafficking operations meant that children continued to be at risk from systematic predatory activities that operated through legitimate medical and social service institutions while maintaining the appearance of legal commercial enterprise. Jennifer realized that her graveyard shift discovery had uncovered evidence of criminal activity that was too extensive and well protected to be eliminated through traditional law enforcement methods, requiring ongoing international cooperation and systematic changes to medical and social service systems. Officer Clark, the organization we've identified, represents a form of systematic exploitation that challenges fundamental assumptions about medical ethics, child protection, and international criminal justice, Agent Martinez concluded. The investigation had revealed that organ trafficking using trafficked children was conducted through networks that included corrupted medical professionals, government officials, and legitimate businesses that provided cover and protection for criminal operations. Federal authorities coordinating international investigations had identified organ trafficking operations in hospitals, medical clinics, and research facilities that maintained legitimate medical practices while also conducting illegal procedures using organs harvested from trafficked victims. The organization operates through legitimate medical institutions that provide cover for illegal activities while also conducting genuine medical procedures that maintain their criminal activity that continues to threaten children throughout the country and internationally, Agent Martinez told Jennifer. The investigation had revealed that systematic organ trafficking was conducted as a global business enterprise with supply chains, distribution networks, and customer service systems that operated like legitimate commercial organizations while conducting the most serious forms of criminal exploitation. As Jennifer completed her graveyard shift and prepared to continue her routine patrols, she understood that her work during overnight hours involved more than responding to individual criminal incidents and maintaining community safety. The graveyard shift brings us into contact with evidence of systematic criminal activity that operates beneath the surface of normal community life, Jennifer reflected as she considered the ongoing implications of her discovery. The peaceful residential neighborhoods where Jennifer conducted her patrols contained families who believed their children were safe and protected. But the investigation had revealed that sophisticated criminal networks operated among legitimate community institutions while conducting systematic exploitation of vulnerable children. Jennifer's discovery of Emma Martinez's bicycle had led to the rescue of specific victims and the disruption of particular criminal operations. But it had also revealed the existence of global criminal enterprises that continued to threaten children through systematic trafficking and organ harvesting operations. Officer Clark, your graveyard shift patrol has contributed to one of the most significant investigations into systematic child exploitation that federal authorities have conducted, Agent Martinez told Jennifer. But the criminal organizations we've identified continue to operate and pose ongoing threats that will require continued vigilance and investigation. The investigation would continue indefinitely as federal and international authorities worked to identify all components of the global organ trafficking networks and develop strategies for protecting children from systematic exploitation that operated through legitimate institutions and professional organizations. Jennifer ended her graveyard shift, knowing that somewhere in the peaceful neighborhood she patrolled, additional evidence of systematic criminal activity might be hidden beneath the normal appearances of suburban family life, waiting to be discovered by officers who paid attention to details that violated established patterns of community safety. The children's bicycle that had started her investigation was now safely returned to Emma Martinez, who was recovering from her ordeal with the support of specialized counseling and medical care. But Jennifer knew that other children's belongings might be arranged in parks and recreational areas where they would serve as evidence of ongoing trafficking operations that continued despite the arrests and disruptions that had resulted from her discovery. The graveyard shift continued, night after night, with officers conducting routine patrols in communities where the most serious threats to child safety operated beneath facades of legitimate medical practice and social service provision. The evil that Jennifer had uncovered would continue in other forms and other locations, protected by its ability to appear legitimate while conducting systematic exploitation of the most vulnerable members of society. The peaceful suburban streets where Jennifer walked her beat contained families sleeping safely in their homes, but they also contained criminal networks that used the overnight hours to conduct surveillance, planning, and coordination for activities that threatened children throughout the community and beyond. The vigilance required to detect and disrupt such operations would need to continue indefinitely, because the organizations conducting them had demonstrated their ability to adapt and resume operations despite significant law enforcement intervention. And in Fairytale Park, where children played during daylight hours under the watchful eyes of parents and caregivers, the playground equipment concealed the entrance to underground facilities that had been used for the most serious forms of criminal exploitation. The park had been restored to normal recreational use, but Jennifer knew that similar facilities might exist beneath other playgrounds and recreational areas where criminal networks continued to operate while maintaining the appearance of legitimate community institutions. The graveyard shift revealed that some forms of evil were so systematic and well organized that they could operate indefinitely beneath the surface of normal community life, requiring eternal vigilance from law enforcement officers who understood that routine patrols could uncover evidence of the most serious threats to child safety and community security. Officer Daniel Roberts had been working the graveyard shift in Modesto for 14 years, and he'd learned to trust the intuition that came from spending thousands of hours patrolling the same neighborhoods during the darkest part of the night. The midnight to 8 a.m. shift brought him into contact with the hidden rhythms of his community, which houses showed lights at unusual hours, which elderly residents had trouble sleeping, and which families dealt with problems that only emerged when the rest of the world was asleep. But as he drove slowly through the Vintage Fair neighborhood, responding to what seemed like a routine wellness check on an elderly resident who hadn't been seen for several days, he had no idea that this call would challenge everything he thought he knew about the fine line between helping someone and becoming complicit in something far more disturbing than he could imagine. The radio call had come in at 12:43 a.m. from a neighbor who was concerned about 73-year-old Margaret Anderson, a retired librarian who lived alone in a small house on Elm Street and was usually very consistent about her daily routines. According to the caller, Margaret hadn't been seen for 3 days. Her mail was accumulating, and her porch light, which she always turned on at sunset, had remained dark for the past 2 nights. Unit 14, respond to 628 Elm Street for a wellness check on elderly resident Margaret Anderson. Caller reports resident hasn't been seen for approximately 72 hours and is not responding to knocks on the door or phone calls. Daniel keyed his radio as he turned onto Elm Street, feeling the familiar concern that came with wellness checks on elderly residents who lived alone. Unit 14 responding. ETA 3 minutes. In his experience, these calls usually resulted in one of 3 outcomes. The person was fine, but had simply changed their routine. They had fallen or become ill and needed medical assistance, or they had died peacefully in their sleep and needed to be discovered with dignity and respect. 628 Elm Street was a small single-story house with neat landscaping and the kind of well-maintained appearance that suggested an owner who took pride in their property despite living on a fixed income. As Daniel parked in front of the house, he immediately noticed the details that had concerned the neighbor. Accumulated mail, newspapers still in plastic bags on the driveway, and a darkness that suggested no one had been moving around inside for several days. Daniel approached the front door and knocked firmly, calling out in the voice he'd developed for wellness checks, loud enough to be heard by someone who might have hearing difficulties, but gentle enough not to frighten someone who might be confused or disoriented. "Mrs. Anderson, this is Officer Roberts with the Modesto Police Department. I'm here to check on your welfare. Please come to the door if you're able." There was no response from inside the house, which could indicate that Margaret Anderson was either unable to answer or was not present. Daniel walked around the perimeter of the house, checking windows and looking for any signs of forced entry, accident, or other circumstances that might explain her absence or inability to respond. The house appeared secure, with no broken windows or doors that had been left open. Daniel could see into some of the rooms through gaps in curtains, and the interior looked neat and undisturbed, suggesting that if something had happened to Margaret Anderson, it had not involved violence or struggle. Daniel returned to the front door and tried knocking again, this time more insistently. "Mrs. Anderson, I need to know that you're okay. If you can hear me but can't come to the door, please make some noise so I know you're inside." This time, Daniel heard something that made him pause and listen more carefully. It wasn't a voice responding to his calls, but a faint sound that seemed to be coming from inside the house. A rhythmic tapping that was too regular to be random house settling, but too quiet to be someone deliberately trying to communicate. Daniel put his ear against the front door and confirmed that he could hear the tapping sound, which seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper in the house. The sound was consistent and deliberate, suggesting that someone inside was either trying to get attention or was engaged in some repetitive activity. Following department protocol for wellness checks where there was evidence that someone might be inside and in distress, Daniel contacted dispatch to request permission to enter the house to ensure Margaret Anderson's safety. Unit 14 to dispatch. I can hear sounds from inside 628 Elm Street that suggest the resident may be present but unable to come to the door. Requesting permission to make entry for welfare check. Copy Unit 14. You're authorized to enter for welfare check. Use minimum necessary force and document everything carefully. Daniel tried the front door and found it unlocked, which was unusual for an elderly person living alone but not unprecedented for someone who might have become confused or disoriented. He opened the door slowly while announcing his presence and purpose. "Mrs. Anderson, this is Officer Roberts. I'm entering your house to make sure you're safe. Please call out if you can hear me." The interior of the house was neat and clean, with the kind of organized simplicity that reflected someone who had lived alone for many years and had developed efficient routines for managing their space. Daniel could see a living room, kitchen, and hallway leading to what were probably bedrooms and a bathroom. The tapping sound was clearer now and seemed to be coming from the back of the house. Daniel moved through the living room toward the hallway, continuing to call out to Margaret Anderson while documenting his observations for the wellness check report. As Daniel approached the source of the tapping sound, he began to hear something else that made him more concerned about Margaret Anderson's condition. Along with the rhythmic tapping, there was a faint voice, barely audible but definitely human, that seemed to be speaking continuously in a tone that suggested confusion or distress. Daniel followed the sounds to a bedroom at the end of the hallway, where he found Margaret Anderson sitting on the edge of her bed, fully dressed, tapping a wooden spoon against the bedside table while speaking quietly to someone who wasn't there. "Mrs. Anderson?" Daniel said gently, not wanting to startle her. "I'm Officer Roberts. Your neighbor was worried about you and asked me to check on your welfare." Margaret looked up at Daniel with eyes that showed the kind of confusion and disorientation that he recognized from previous encounters with elderly residents suffering from dementia or other cognitive impairments. She seemed to see him, but didn't appear to understand who he was or why he was in her house. "Have you seen my visitor?" Margaret asked in a voice that was surprisingly clear and coherent despite her obvious confusion. "He's been coming every night for a week, and I want to make sure he knows I've been waiting for him." Daniel felt relief that Margaret Anderson appeared to be physically safe, but her mention of a nightly visitor raised questions about her mental state and potentially about her safety if someone had been taking advantage of her confusion. "Mrs. Anderson, can you tell me about this visitor? What does he look like, and when does he usually come to see you?" Margaret's response revealed that she had been experiencing what appeared to be hallucinations or delusions about someone who visited her during overnight hours. Her description was detailed and consistent, suggesting that whatever she was experiencing felt very real to her, even if it was the product of cognitive impairment. "He's a very nice young man, probably about 30 years old, and he always comes between midnight and dawn," Margaret explained, with the kind of matter-of-fact tone that made her delusion sound completely reasonable. "He helps me with things around the house and keeps me company when I can't sleep. I've been tapping to let him know I'm awake and ready for his visit." Daniel realized that Margaret Anderson was experiencing cognitive impairment that was causing her to believe she was receiving regular visits from someone who didn't exist. The tapping sound that had led him to find her was her attempt to signal to an imaginary visitor that she was ready for his nightly visit. "Mrs. Anderson, I think you might be confused about this visitor," Daniel said gently. "Sometimes when people live alone, especially at night, our minds can play tricks on us and make us think we're seeing or hearing people who aren't really there." Margaret's reaction to Daniel's suggestion was immediate and surprisingly forceful for someone who had seemed confused and disoriented just moments before. "Officer, I know the difference between real people and imaginary ones," she said, with a clarity that made Daniel reconsider his assumption about her mental state. My visitor's very real, and he's been helping me with problems that I couldn't solve on my own. Daniel sat down in the chair across from Margaret's bed, recognizing that he needed to take more time to understand her situation before making assumptions about hallucinations or cognitive impairment. Mrs. Anderson, can you tell me more about how this person helps you? What kinds of problems has he been solving? Margaret's response revealed details that were far more specific and practical than Daniel would have expected from someone experiencing delusions. Last Tuesday, my kitchen faucet was dripping and I couldn't get it to stop. He fixed it for me that night, and it hasn't dripped since. Thursday, my back door lock was sticking, and he adjusted it so it works perfectly now. Yesterday, he helped me organize my medications so I wouldn't get confused about which ones to take when... The specificity of Margaret's examples and her mention of tangible improvements to her house made Daniel more concerned about the possibility that someone was actually visiting her during overnight hours. If Margaret wasn't hallucinating, then someone had been entering her house while she slept, and that person's intentions might not be as benevolent as Margaret believed. Mrs. Anderson, how does this person get into your house? Daniel asked. Do you let him in through the front door, or does he have a key? I never see him arrive or leave, Margaret replied. I just know that when I'm tapping to let him know I'm awake, he always appears in my house sometime during the night. He never uses the front door because I would hear that. He must know another way to get inside. Daniel felt a chill as he realized that if Margaret was telling the truth, someone had been regularly entering her house during overnight hours without her knowledge of how they gained access. The visitor could be someone who had figured out how to enter the house without detection and was taking advantage of Margaret's isolation and possible confusion to gain her trust while pursuing unknown motives. Mrs. Anderson, I need to check your house to make sure all the doors and windows are secure, Daniel said, recognizing that he might be dealing with a breaking and entering situation rather than wellness check on a confused elderly resident. Can you stay here while I look around? Daniel began a systematic examination of Margaret's house, checking all doors and windows for signs of forced entry or unauthorized access. What he found would transform his understanding of the situation and raise disturbing questions about who had been visiting Margaret Anderson during the overnight hours. The back door showed subtle signs of tampering around the lock mechanism. Scratches and wear patterns that suggested someone had been manipulating the lock regularly over an extended period. The lock itself appeared to function normally, but Daniel recognized the signs of someone who had developed the skill to open it without a key. More concerning, Daniel found evidence in the kitchen and living room that someone had indeed been in the house recently and had been making the improvements that Margaret had described. The kitchen faucet showed signs of recent repair work, the back door lock had been lubricated and adjusted, and Margaret's medications were organized in a way that appeared professional and systematic. Mrs. Anderson, Daniel called as he returned to the bedroom. Someone has definitely been in your house, and they've been doing the things you described. This isn't your imagination, but I'm concerned about who this person is and why they're coming into your house without your permission. Margaret's response revealed that she had not given permission for the visits and had no idea who the person was or how they had gained access to her house. I don't know who he is, officer. He's never told me his name, and he doesn't talk much when he's here. He just does whatever needs to be done, and then he's gone before I realize it. Daniel realized that he was dealing with someone who had been regularly breaking into Margaret Anderson's house, but instead of stealing property or causing harm, they had been making repairs and improvements. The situation was unlike anything in his 14 years of law enforcement experience. Mrs. Anderson, I need you to understand that Someone entering your house without permission is breaking the law, even if they're helping you, Daniel explained. We need to find out who this person is and make sure they're not planning to hurt you or take advantage of you. Daniel contacted dispatch to request detective division assistance and potentially a crime scene investigation to document the evidence of unauthorized entry and determine the identity and motives of the person who had been visiting Margaret Anderson. Unit 14, requesting detective assistance at 628 Elm Street. I have evidence of ongoing breaking and entering, but the circumstances are unusual and require investigation beyond routine B and E protocols. Copy Unit 14. Detective Martinez en route, ETA 15 minutes. As Daniel waited for detective assistance, he continued talking with Margaret Anderson to gather more information about her mysterious visitor. What he learned would reveal that the situation was even more complex and potentially dangerous than he had initially realized. Mrs. Anderson, besides the repairs and help with your medications, has this person ever asked you for anything or tried to get information about your finances, your family, or your personal business? Margaret's response revealed that her visitor had indeed been asking questions, but not about the topics that Daniel would have expected from someone with criminal intentions. He asks me about my health, about whether I'm eating properly, and about whether I have family members who check on me. He seems very concerned about my welfare, but he's never asked about money or valuables. The pattern Margaret described suggested someone who was conducting welfare checks rather than planning criminal activity, but the unauthorized entry and secretive nature of the visits indicated that the person's motives might be more complex than simple concern for an elderly resident's well-being. Daniel began to consider the possibility that Margaret Anderson's visitor might be someone with access to information about elderly residents who lived alone. Perhaps a home health care worker, social services employee, or someone else who had legitimate reasons to be concerned about her welfare, but was using unauthorized methods to provide assistance. Mrs. Anderson, have you had any contact with social services, home health care workers, or other people whose job involves checking on elderly residents? Daniel asked. I haven't had any official visits from social services or health care workers, Margaret replied. But about 2 months ago, a young man came to my door during the day and said he was conducting a survey about services for elderly residents. He asked a lot of questions about whether I had family nearby, whether I had help with household tasks, and whether I felt safe living alone. Daniel realized that Margaret's daytime visitor might be the same person who had been entering her house during overnight hours. The survey had provided an opportunity to assess her living situation, identify her vulnerabilities, and potentially plan the unauthorized visits that had been occurring. Mrs. Anderson, can you describe the person who conducted the survey? Did he give you any identification or business cards? Margaret's description of the survey worker matched her description of her nighttime visitor, confirming Daniel's suspicion that the same person was responsible for both contacts. More concerning, Margaret had no official documentation of the survey, suggesting that it had been conducted under false pretenses. He said his name was Michael, and he showed me an official-looking badge, but I don't remember what organization he said he worked for, Margaret recalled. He was very polite and seemed genuinely concerned about my welfare. Daniel was beginning to understand that Margaret Anderson had been targeted by someone who used legitimate-seeming surveys to identify vulnerable elderly residents, then used the information gathered to plan unauthorized visits that appeared helpful but might serve other purposes. The situation represented a form of criminal activity that Daniel had never encountered. Someone who was breaking into houses to help rather than harm, but whose true motives and long-term intentions remained unknown. Detective Maria Martinez arrived at Margaret Anderson's house with 8 years of experience, investigating unusual criminal cases, but the situation that Officer Roberts briefed her on was unlike anything she had encountered in her career. Someone had been regularly breaking into an elderly woman's house to make repairs and provide assistance, creating a scenario that challenged traditional approaches to investigating unauthorized entry. Officer Roberts, this situation suggests someone who has developed an unusual relationship with Mrs. Anderson, but we need to determine whether their intentions are genuinely helpful or whether this is part of a larger pattern of behavior that could become dangerous, Detective Martinez explained as she prepared to interview Margaret and examined the evidence of unauthorized entry. Daniel accompanied Detective Martinez as she conducted a comprehensive interview with Margaret Anderson, gathering detailed information about her mysterious visitor and the pattern of assistance he had been providing. What Margaret revealed would demonstrate that the situation was both more complex and more disturbing than either officer had initially realized. Mrs. Anderson, I want you to think carefully about everything your visitor has done during his time in your house, Detective Martinez began. Has he ever gone into rooms that weren't directly related to the problems he was fixing? Has he looked through your personal belongings or asked to see documents like bank statements or insurance papers? Margaret's response revealed that her visitor had indeed been examining areas of her house and personal belongings that went beyond the repairs and assistance he had provided. Now that you mention it, I have noticed that things in my bedroom and office area have been moved slightly. I thought I was just forgetting where I put things, but he might have been looking through my papers. The revelation that the visitor had been examining Margaret's personal belongings and documents suggested that his assistance with household repairs might be a cover for gathering information about her financial situation, personal relationships, and vulnerabilities that could be exploited for criminal purposes. Detective Martinez expanded her investigation to include a comprehensive examination of Margaret's house for evidence of surveillance, data gathering, or other activities that would indicate criminal intent beyond simple unauthorized entry. Officer Roberts, what we're seeing here fits the pattern of someone who targets elderly residents living alone, gains their trust through helpful behavior, then uses access to their homes to gather information for financial exploitation or other criminal activities, Martinez explained. The investigation revealed evidence that Margaret's visitor had been systematically examining her personal documents, mail, and financial records, while also making the repairs and improvements that had gained her trust and gratitude. Hidden in Margaret's office area, Detective Martinez found evidence that someone had been photographing her bank statements, insurance documents, and personal correspondence. The photographs had been taken with a small, high-quality camera that suggested professional-level surveillance rather than casual snooping. Mrs. Anderson, your visitor has been conducting systematic surveillance of your personal and financial information, Detective Martinez told Margaret. The repairs and assistance he's been providing appear to be designed to gain your trust, while he gathers information that could be used to steal your identity or access your financial accounts. The discovery transformed the investigation from an unusual breaking and entering case to a systematic identity theft and financial exploitation operation targeting elderly residents. Margaret Anderson was a victim of a sophisticated criminal who used helpful behavior to mask predatory intentions. Detective Martinez coordinated with the department's Financial Crimes Division to analyze the evidence of identity theft and determine the scope of the criminal operation. The investigation would need to identify other potential victims and assess the damage that might have been done to Margaret's financial security. Mrs. Anderson, we're going to need to contact your bank and credit card companies to put fraud alerts on all your accounts, Detective Martinez explained. We also need to review your financial statements to see if any unauthorized transactions have occurred. The investigation revealed that Margaret Anderson's visitor had not yet used the financial information he had gathered, suggesting that he might be in the early stages of a long-term exploitation plan, or that he was gathering information for sale to other criminals who would conduct the actual financial theft. Detective Martinez's analysis of the surveillance evidence revealed that the criminal had been using sophisticated techniques to gather comprehensive information about Margaret's financial situation, personal relationships, and daily routines that would be valuable for planning various forms of exploitation. The level of surveillance and information gathering suggests someone with experience in identity theft and financial exploitation, Martinez observed. This person has been conducting professional-level intelligence gathering while using helpful behavior to avoid suspicion. Daniel learned that the criminal operation revealed by Margaret Anderson's case represented a new form of elder abuse that used psychological manipulation and false trust to gain access to victims' homes and personal information. Officer Roberts, this case demonstrates how criminals are adapting traditional elder abuse techniques to exploit elderly residents' desire for help and companionship, Detective Martinez explained. The victim actually welcomes the criminal into their home because they believe they're receiving beneficial assistance. The investigation expanded to include other elderly residents in the neighborhood who might have been targeted by the same criminal using similar techniques. Detective Martinez coordinated with social services and community organizations to identify other potential victims. "We need to assume that Mrs. Anderson isn't the only victim," Martinez told Daniel. "This criminal has probably been using the same approach with other elderly residents who live alone and might need assistance with household maintenance." The expanded investigation revealed that at least 6 other elderly residents in the area had been contacted by someone conducting surveys about services for elderly residents, and several had reported mysterious improvements to their homes that they couldn't explain. The criminal has been operating systematically throughout this neighborhood, identifying vulnerable elderly residents and using the same approach to gain access to their homes and personal information, Detective Martinez concluded. The investigation had uncovered a criminal operation that represented a sophisticated form of elder abuse that used psychological manipulation and false helpfulness to exploit vulnerable residents. The criminal had been conducting what amounted to a business operation, targeting elderly residents for identity theft and financial exploitation. Daniel's wellness check on Margaret Anderson had uncovered evidence of systematic criminal activity that threatened vulnerable residents throughout the community. The mysterious visitor who had seemed helpful and benevolent was actually a predator who used helpful behavior to mask criminal intentions. "Mrs. Anderson, I want you to understand that you haven't done anything wrong," Detective Martinez told Margaret as the investigation concluded. "This person took advantage of your isolation and your need for assistance to gain access to information that he planned to use to hurt you financially." The investigation revealed that Margaret Anderson's gratitude toward her mysterious visitor had been the result of psychological manipulation designed to make her trust someone who was actually planning to exploit her vulnerability for financial gain. Detective Martinez coordinated with federal authorities to investigate the possibility that the criminal operation extended beyond the local area and involved networks of individuals who specialized in targeting elderly residents for identity theft and financial exploitation. Officer Roberts, this case demonstrates that even helpful behavior can be criminal when it's used to gain unauthorized access to people's homes and personal information, Martinez concluded. Daniel realized that his routine graveyard shift wellness check had uncovered a form of criminal activity that challenged traditional assumptions about how criminals operated and how they identified and exploited their victims. The peaceful neighborhood where Daniel had conducted hundreds of similar wellness checks contained a predator who used helpful behavior and false concern to mask systematic criminal activity targeting the most vulnerable residents. Margaret Anderson would require ongoing support to address the psychological impact of learning that someone she had trusted and appreciated was actually planning to exploit her for financial gain. The violation of trust involved in the criminal's approach represented a form of emotional abuse that accompanied the attempted financial exploitation. Mrs. Anderson, we're going to make sure you have support from social services and community organizations to help you feel safe and secure in your home, Detective Martinez assured her. The investigation would continue as law enforcement worked to identify and arrest the criminal responsible for the systematic exploitation of elderly residents. The case had revealed a form of elder abuse that used psychological manipulation and false helpfulness to exploit vulnerable people's trust and gratitude. Daniel ended his graveyard shift knowing that his response to a routine wellness check had protected an elderly resident from financial exploitation and had uncovered criminal activity that threatened vulnerable people throughout the community. The mysterious visitor who had seemed like a guardian angel helping an isolated elderly woman was actually a predator who used helpful behavior to mask criminal intentions. The graveyard shift had revealed that even seemingly benevolent behavior could conceal dangerous criminal activity when it was used to exploit vulnerable people's trust and need for assistance. In the quiet residential neighborhoods that Daniel patrolled during his overnight hours, other elderly residents living alone might be receiving similar helpful visits from criminals who used false concern and beneficial actions to gain access to homes and personal information for exploitation purposes. The darkness that emerged during the graveyard shift included predators who understood that the most effective way to exploit vulnerable people was to make them grateful for the very actions that facilitated their victimization. Margaret Anderson's case had revealed that some of the most dangerous criminals were those who appeared to be the most helpful and caring.